哦，就是刘梦平写了个大。
观众朋友们好，感谢大家来到今天的思想先驱报节目现场啊！在节目开始之前，何明先生还在焦急的跟这个自己的这个同事和朋友通话啊。我们的这个声音不知道有没有进去了，如果进去的话，向各位网友表示道歉。这个何斌先生啊，每天啊是一场接着一场的上节目啊。但是呢，何斌先生啊，经常跟我们抱怨啊，天天给你当这个思想先驱报的陪榜，能不能换一个人？那如果大家呢各位网友中有希望做李琦的思想先驱报的联合主持啊，那么把这个何斌先生替下去，那我当然是非常兴奋的啊。那么如果呢，
我更高兴。
当然咱们也是认真的说，也是开玩笑的说啊，这个思想先驱报啊做到现在，那么其实呢，大家也都很明白，我们希望带来一些新鲜的、不同的视角，不仅仅是谈论中国问题，不仅仅谈论政治问题，有关于经济的、科技的、文化的，近期看过的电影、电视和最近的好书，所有这一些话题呀，只要有独特的见解和角度，能够为我们的观众朋友们带来一些新鲜、不同的视角和观念，我们都希望在思想先驱报中能够有所介绍。那如果您有一技所长啊，如果您所学的专业可能是您特别希望与我们的观众朋友们分享的，那么赶快把何明先生换下去，这样呢，他可以踏踏实实的吃个饭啊，跟自己的老朋友啊叙叙旧啊，同时呢跟网友聊一聊天啊。那么我呢身边也可以换一个更好的联合主持人，希望各位网友踊跃自荐，或者是推荐他人。这个何明先生啊，这把椅子坐的已经是十分的不耐烦，每天在这儿是如坐针毡。我在这边嘚啵说，何明先生那边玩手机呀，打一打游戏呀，炒一炒股票啊。我才
不玩游戏，完全造谣，我也不炒股票。
然后这个点赞一些美女美图啊，各种各样的事情啊。关于和平先生的这一些私下的细节，改天等他换掉他这一位联合主持人后，再与各位进行详细的揭露。今天话归正传，回到中国本身的经济问题。有关于中国的经济问题近期可以说是铺天盖地的报道来自国际媒体的，来自中国内部的一些专业人士的分析。其实呢，不同的分析角度总能给我们不一样的思考。但是今天要向大家特别介绍的是来自彭博社的一篇长篇报道。这一篇报道的名字非常的有趣，叫做《冷处理：习近平为何放任中国经济徘徊不前》。为什么叫冷处理呢？与习近平的冷处理形成对比的就是美国以及其他的欧洲国家在面对经济疫情压力下行之时所采取的热处理的办法。即使现在中国甚至可能面临通缩的风险，中国也不采取大规模的刺激措施，这个背后的原因到底是什么？彭博社的这一篇文章刚开始就告诉我们，这个过去中国经济发展的奇迹可以说是引领了中国一代人的生活的质量的迅速的提高。但是习近平现在似乎正在试图改写中国经济发展的游戏规则，但是改写规则能不能够成功，却面临严峻的考验。文章开始就向我们介绍了一整组数据，中国18万亿美元的经济现在出现了减速，消费者情绪比较低落，出口也十分的艰难，物价甚至出现了下跌的风险。中国有1/5以上的年轻人找不到工作，其中很多困境并不是这一次疫情开始之后才产生的，也不完全是由疫情期间的封锁造成的。在习近平任期的前几年，那么他呢就决心摆脱之前的胡温时代以债务为动力的经济增长模式，即使是导致了房地产危机愈演愈烈，但是缓解危机的措施却始终不拿出来。结果这样的一个对待经济的手法促使摩根大通、巴克利银行、摩根士丹利等机构一致下调了对于中国经济增长的预测。现在市场的普遍预期已经低于政府在年初设定的5%的目标。外国投资者对于中国市场的情绪也出现了转冷，甚至有一些投资人正在撤出资金。今天早上我看到一篇非常有趣的文章某一位机构一位明星分析师说，这个外资就是搅屎棍说外资没有什么节操，也没有什么水准。当然了，有人说你这个搅屎棍，那搅的是什么？你是在说中国股市是什么感人感觉呢有这么一点大不敬的意思。外国投资者正在撤出，这个时候是跟风而行还是明智之举？大家外界评价显然也不一致。而中国央行现在也面临着严峻的挑战，正在加大力度阻止人民币喋喋不休。 美国财政部长耶伦被认为呢是一位非常专业的经济人士，也表示中国现在已经成为了美国的一个风险因素，讲到的是中国对于整个国际市场可能产生的影响。而美国的总统拜登甚至在最近的一次竞选集会活动中直接说中国经济是一颗定时炸弹，也引起了北京方面很大的愤怒。那么，美国和中国在处理本国所面临的经济挑战时，采取的方式各自有哪一些特点呢？我们先来看美国采取的方式。来自彭博社的报道，把这一种方式归结成为叫做热经济，用数万亿美元来刺激家庭消费和基础设施建设，可以说是一脚油门踩到底，希望因为疫情陷入困顿的美国经济可以迅速的复苏。而习近平呢，采取的是冷处理的办法。根据来自彭博社的分析，他希望最终能够打破中国此前靠投机性房地产建设、不透明的地方借贷资助的低回报项目来推动经济增长找出的一系列的顾及问题。如果说中国是一颗定时炸弹，那么习近平似乎也是笃定了目标，拆除这一颗炸弹，不引爆这一颗炸弹。来自彭博社的报道分析这世界两大经济体之间有关于经济管理理念的冲突，其实现在成为了改变投资流向的重要因素。那么如果习近平拆弹不善，这可能会导致中国超越美国的日期继续往后延后，甚至有一些经济学家认为这样的时刻可能永远也不会到来了。习近平不仅仅是他一个人，还有他所领导的一个被认为对于他政治上忠诚的团队，他们的风险在于什么呢？拆弹没有拆好，这颗蛋还是破了。还有一种就是避免过度刺激，导致大家对于经济发展的信心一下子削弱，情绪转于悲观，而对于中国经济发展的悲观预言成了自我实现的诺言。有一位经济学者叫做霍夫曼他现在好像在新加坡的一所大学教经济学，他同时是世界银行前中国部的主任。他讲到中国的衰退是什么呢？叫做预期衰退。什么叫做预期衰退？一旦整个经济体的所有的参与者都认为未来的经济增长会出现放缓，那么可能未来的经济增长就真的会放缓，所谓自我实现的预言。如果摩根大通对于中国经济增长放缓的趋势数字是正确的，那么中国将面临的情势是连续3年 GDP 的增长率低于5%。根据来自彭博社的统计，这是1976年以后就没有出现的情况。甚至有经济学家预言，这样的一种经济放缓的态势是不是会以永久性的停滞，或者是所谓的日本化而告终。也有一些经济学家现在看到中国最新的消费价格指数，认为中国已经出现了通货紧缩的警告信号。物价下跌既是需求疲软的表现，也有可能会拖累未来的经济增长。首先是家庭推迟购买，那么家庭不买东西了，企业的利润也就会下降，企业的利润下降了，企业实际的借贷成本也就会进一步的上升，导致投资活动的进一步放缓。有这样的一个词叫做动物精神。什么叫动物精神呢？简而言之就是企业家的某一种冒险精神。现在企业家的动物精神似乎有所丧失之前中国对于一些行业的打压，特别是对于互联网行业的打压，让很多现在在中国的企业家过去认为中国是挣钱的福地，现在也是转而寻求海外的机会。再加上房地产行业的急剧下滑与美国裂痕的加深，导致现在对于中国经济增长的预期下调已经成为既定的事实。而彭博社的首席经济学家汤姆·奥利克甚至预计，到2030年，中国的年增长率可能会放缓至3.5个百分点左右。那我们也知道中国在过去的几年里受到经济危机或者是萧条的威胁，其实并不是第一次。比如2015年著名的股灾，当时也是引发了混乱的人民币贬值，国内股市的全部崩盘。耶伦女士当时还是美联储的主席，那么当时中国股市出现的情况，就让作为美联储主席的耶伦女士感到十分的不安。那么直接是取消了原定的加息活动。现在是不是到了这一步呢？对于美联储加息减息的预期，是不是再有可能受到中国市场的影响呢？暂停加息变成降息的速度，是不是会比市场预期更快呢？ 简而言之，由于中国现在已经是一个庞然大物的经济体，它的经济状况所出现的外溢效应也远远不能够控制在中国本国的边境之内。有关于彭博社关于中国经济冷处理、美国经济热处理这种哲学和秘你怎么看？
我觉得这几乎是一种正常的现象嘛。我们渐渐知道，过去30-40年，中国已经持续的这么高速的经济增长。任何一个经济体，任何一个国家在发展过程中间，无论是计划经济还是市场经济，基本上没有办法呢，按照原来的预期发展的那么美好，那么均衡。某个阶段的产业的失控，某个产业的爆破，或者是某个产业这种不像大家预期的这么发展在新的这种经济的加速度的发展之下，这本身就是应该需要这个条件。而这个条件的杠杆呢，按照我们原来的很多的对市场经济的理解或者是想象，应该通过市场经济的调节，在某些方面可能还是的。或者这种体现出来的呢，还是市场的这种巨大的这个自由调节能力。但是对于一个国家来讲，它有没有承受能力来让市场去自由调整，这就需要了有非常坚实的这种法治大家比较信任的法治，大家对前途有某一些信心，或者说呢整个国际环境呢比较好，或者说呢你本身的产业呢只是一时的这个现象。所以如果在这种情况之下，你要去放心的去冷处理，那当然是没有问题。但是中国的情况很显然要比这个要复杂很多，缺乏一个法治的环境政治意识形态的过分的宣扬那么资金过于的集结在某一些领域又找不到新的这种出口。那么这又是加上所谓的大家热门词叫地缘政治或者是中美关系那么全球的经济的影响，很多的不利因素堆积在一起，再加上习近平的强势的集权领导那么这样的话呢，它会不会这种形成一个巨大的洪流？就是像刚才李杰博士介绍的世界银行的前中国局长讲的是个自我实现的预言。我说如果假如是能够实现这个自我实现的预言，中国真的是衰退了比日本还要糟糕或者甚至呢是一个更大的一个南美的陷阱这是呢某一些急迫的政治变革的朋友他的某一些潜在的一种心理，或者说呢对中国的这些年的发展自己找不到理由来去理解或者是支持中国这种发展的这种状况的人，或者还有其他的跟中国竞争的人，他们当然心里面呢期待到中国呢走向这样一种状况。而站在习近平的角度来讲现在我不知道他有没有一份奉天日报，我看也不需要，因为中国的媒体几乎都是奉天日报都是跟现实的世界有脱离非常之大，甚至可以说是扭曲对这个世界的认知，更扭曲中国的情况。在媒体和信息的角度来讲，中国这个不会比文化大革命好到哪里去甚至可以说呢比今天的俄罗斯的情况还要糟糕。那么习近平是在什么情况之下形成他的决策？他的决策是完全被马屁精包围了，被扭曲的信息包围了，还是过度的这个自信？还是说呢他认为就像彭博同学讲的，其实他知道这些问题的存在是几乎必须经过的一个痛苦。就像朱镕基的时代，大家记得吗？那个时候的游行抗议示威比现在要真实的很多。为什么？很多的下岗工人一旦丢了铁饭碗，他就没有了人生，因为他一辈子就是端着这个铁饭碗，认为呢自己的一辈子就这样了结果突然之间你把我的饭碗端掉了而且呢把工程卖给别的人。那个时候的下岗工人的这种悲惨的情况，到今天还在延伸在这个东北东北是非常非常严重的。所以我们现在在法拉盛在纽约，在很多的地方开始见到了从最开始的农民 福建广东这些地方的农民逃亡或者是偷渡过来，后来慢慢变成了东北人，用各种各样的方式到了这个美国来我跟他们也交流过很多我也在东北有很多的这个朋友，东北人也有他特殊的个性，很有趣的一点。但是东北当大家认为东北要完蛋了，对吧？再也没有希望了。这是我听到很多离开东北人的，他们真的是一种非常真实的声音，所以他们对共产党的厌恶，对习近平的怨恨，那是非常之多的，对前途的绝望但是事实上大家看一看今年的 GDP 的增长，从长春到哈尔滨，从大连到沈阳它的 GDP 的增长甚至比南方的城市还要好。也许你可以说它的底子很薄所谓的上升比较快，但是你就不注意到中国的60之后的中国的经济发展其实在不经意之间这么追起来的。92年并没有带来一个资金立即的引入，92年并没有重新引起大家的希望，是92年、93年、94年、95年、96年、97年、98年这样慢慢发展，最终到了21世纪，在猛然发现中国成为了世界上最重要的一个经济体。所以很多的看法这个需要更多的数据，很多的看法需要更开阔的心，很多的看法你要真要根据的实际的情况。今天中国是不是所有的产业都摧毁了？房地产不行了，房地产的不行对整体的经济是彻底的拖垮，还是一些连带的一些反应，比如说上下游整个系统的资金都受到一些产业受到影响？还是说呢，中国也在跟美国一样的，跟世界上很多的国家一样的，努力想改变自己的产业的结构，努力想改变自己的这个生产形态？他说的我认为是后者中国和全世界很多的国家一样的，也在挣扎着走出疫情之后的这样一个带来的负面作用，走出一个全球的新技术浪潮所带来的这样一个背景，走向迎合这个浪潮，走向一个呢全球化的一种冲击等等每一个国家其实都在努力往上走只是走的程度呢不太一样，其实大致的方向不一样。中国比较令人厌恶的是就是它的意识形态的对大家的污染，媒体的控制，对大家认知的一种扭曲。但是就算是这样，中国的经济的变革根本没有停止步伐。我今天早上在刷牙的时候，我突然就想起来70年代当年所谓的粉色四人帮之后，我们看到了最激动人心的一篇文章，是大家不太喜欢的一个文人写的，叫古美入他写的文章的标题我现在都记得，叫《科学的春天》。也就是说，中国不管有什么意识形态的封锁，在80年代、70年代末期开始，对科学的尊重，对数理化的尊重，成为这个国家的真正的一个驱动力而这一点到现在为止也没有改变。有政治的污染，有外部环境的影响，但是中国的经济在我看起来比较大的几率走出这个危机。虽然现在是暴风雨很厉害，但是这是一时的现象，甚至这个现象可能是必要的痛苦。
好，谢谢何明先生那么来自彭博社的这一篇文章呢，其实大致的分析思路与刚才何明先生分析的相同。它基本上的一个思路就是什么呢？我们要了解中国政府为什么没有采取更多的措施来对经济进行热助力这样的问题。最根本的一点就是，我们先要从中国政府的角度来评估中国经济的前景，以及习近平到底要实现什么样的目标，他认为实现目标的看法。简而言之，就是不能以西方的视角来看中国怎样处理自己的问题，
也不能以老百姓的情绪
来看这个到底怎样处理一个问题那么习近平对于中国经济的发展的目标是什么呢？来自彭博社的报道告诉我们，其实习近平自己也说了，本世纪中叶把中国建设成为综合国力和国际影响力领先的世界国。当然这个话说的非常的没有意思，具体而言叫做高质量发展。所谓的高质量发展对应的就是低质量的发展。 彭博社这一篇文章还提醒我们，虽然我们看到中国经济现在有各种各样的问题，但是同样不可忽视的是，中国有一些领域正在蓬勃发展，比如电动汽车、太阳能、风能，还有电池等等等等。在这一些领域，不管是投资还是出口，正在以2位数的速度持续高速增长，而这一些正是习近平所看重的高科技绿色增长。即使在某一些领域实施了更加紧缩的政策，其实中国国家在投入资源促进这一种形式的增长方面，并没有体现出弱化的迹象。现在呀，发行债券为高铁和可再生能源基础设施提供资金，规模在世界上任何一个地方都是没有办法可比的。通过为电动汽车的购买者减税，为消费者需求提供支持的速度也并没有停下来。因此啊，我们说中国不刺激经济，不刺激经济，其实这个话既对也不对。对于一些习近平真正重视的产业，所谓高科技、绿色能源产业，其实现在不仅仅是对于投资的这个补贴啊，对于消费的补贴一样，脚步根本就没有停下来。这一点呢，是我们需要知道的。当你看到中国政府不刺激经济的时候，往往只是看到了事情的一面，也许它不刺激的正是它不希望发展的这一些经济的领域。另外呀，有关于消费需求不振这一点，来自彭博社的文章呢也讲到了另外一方面的情况，就是旅游和餐饮服务业的消费其实与去年年底相比还是出现了比较强劲的反弹，而且呢，这个反弹不仅仅是集中在中国国内的品牌，比如星巴克一家美国咖啡企业，上一季度在中国的销售额同比增长了多少呢？增长了46%。现在国内航班还远远没有恢复，但是也比疫情封锁之前高出了大概15%。这个游客呀，如果大家到中国的一些旅游服务网站上去看，他们经常抱怨的是酒店因为需求飙升而不断的涨价而并不是这一些这个就说没有这样的消费需求。而同时呢，现在这样的一个需求的反弹，其实对于带活现在的就业市场也有帮助，这对于缓解领导层对于出现大规模失业的担忧也是有一定影响的。但是问题是什么呢？所有这一些可能远远不够，因为房地产对于整个中国经济而言实在太过重要。即使是新能源汽车这样的新兴产业，现在看起来被世界瞩目，世界认为中国发展得很好，但是新增长的引擎带动整个经济还是需要相当长的一段时间的。中国毕竟是一个庞大而复杂的经济体，整个房地产行业的垮掉给整个的经济仍然是地震一般的拖累。这呢，通过几个少数经济中光明的亮点，不能够掩盖整个中国经济所面临的基本的问题。但是类似的思路我们继续往下推演，所谓的新经济也就是绿色制造业微芯片高科技领域这样的一个笼统的称呼，在上半年的同比增长是多少呢？比这个 GDP 的比重高非常之多，已经占到17%，而 GDP 上半年同比增长只有6.5%。而房地产行业在上半年的增长是多少呢？非但没有增长，还出现了下滑了将近8%。加上其他的房地产上下游的相关产业，整个房地产产业占到 GDP 的20%。也就是我们看到虽然房地产这一边是一缓，新经济这一边是一增一快，但是毕竟房地产的体量大，因此我们算一个加权平均数，对于整个经济仍然是负面的拖累因素比较低。当然了，我们也说中国政府现在对于经济采取冷处理，特别是对于房地产行业和债务问题，也不是说什么都不做那比如说之前的这个3条红线，现在就有所放松了。对于这个贷款需要达到的杠杆率基准，现在呢也是有所减缓。恒大出现了违约，其他的建筑商也出现了债务违约潮。现在那么中央的一些经济官员也到这些企业来进行有关的座谈，帮助他们处理困难。那么之前的一些优质的开发商，比如碧桂园，也出现偿还债券能力存在重大不确定性这样的风险，这也是中国政府必须要解决的问题。而根本的仍然是整个房地产销售的下降。如果来自彭博社的报道正确的话，现在2023年截止目前的这样的一个房地产的销售额，比2020年的同期峰值水平已经下降了50%。不仅仅是房地产公司本身，建筑、钢铁、水泥、玻璃全部都受到了影响。 那么这样的一个房屋价值的下降啊，很大的这样的一个降幅，对于家庭的财富也造成了严重的侵蚀。一般啊认为，整个房地产占到了中国家庭财富比例的70%到80%，占到了银行抵押价值的40%，毕竟仍然是一个重大的风险所在。企业如果再继续降低利润预期，缩减投资，缩减招聘计划，可能啊对于整个经济的拖累效应就越来越大了。现在呀，上海等一些城市也已经发出了警告，表示有一些非正式行业、零工经济，比如啊网约车、私家车上街啊这样的一些职业呀，已经出现了供过于求。这无疑是劳动力需求疲软的一个信号。我们也知道，在美国啊，你再开一辆啊这样的，比如说 Uber 或者是 Lyft 啊，那么如果呢Uber 和 Lyft 的司机出现了供过于求，往往是因为某一些行业出现了大裁员等等等等。之前我们在报纸上啊也看过这样的新闻啊，本来呀是在亚马逊工作的美国的科技白领，结果呢遭遇啊这样的一个失业裁员潮，没有办法，只能是一边开 Uber 啊接送客，晚上啊就去酒吧打一点零工，让人觉得这一些啊天之骄子，美国最聪明的年轻人，因为整个科技行业的调整，陷入这样的职业的不确定性，让人也觉得十分的痛心。当然了，中国政府内部也有不同的声音，对于现在中央似乎采取的冷处理的思路也有不同的建议。比如央行的顾问啊蔡方最近呢就曾经在公开场合呼吁要直接刺激消费，认为由中央政府如果借贷几万亿人民币直接投资刺激消费，可以对于经济情绪的改善起到根本的作用。但是现在呀，其实情况也已经比较明了了，中国政府基本是不会采取大撒币、大发钱来刺激消费这样的措施。此前我们在节目中为大家介绍瑞银的中国首席王涛有关于中国经济的分析，他就讲到了一点，说对于中国领导人而言呢，支持消费的最佳途径是支持就业，支持就业的最佳途径是通过减税来支持企业。简而言之，支持企业、支持商业部门比直接发钱到消费者手中来得更加的有效。这是中国经济管理思路与美国非常不同的一点。另外呀，习近平过去也曾经在多个场合警告，不能陷入福利主义的陷阱。对于中国这样一个有14亿人口又极其不平等的国家而言，家庭到底应该获得整个 GDP 收入占比的多少？这呀不仅仅是一个经济问题，其实也是一个政治问题，涉及到对于普通中国民众的赋权问题。那么昨天呢，我还采访到了来自康奈尔大学的一位经济以及研究劳工问题的教授，他就特别讲到了这一点，就是为什么中国要向家庭消费倾斜，这个过程可能不像西方的一些经济学者想的这么简单。那么中国始终认为生产力是第一要务，另外呢，如果把太多的财富移到了普通的民间，可能会导致政府的财力单薄，政府对于经济的管理和对政治的把控能力都会有所下降。习近平近期还不断的警告手下的官员和官僚，不能为了经济增长而牺牲国家安全和风险防范。比如习近平在今年夏天发表的一次讲话中说有一些干部跟不上新的发展要求，有人说发展就是上项目、搞投资、扩规模。曾经美国财政部的一位官员就表示，习近平在多个关键时刻都强调地方官员要严防金融风险，不能追求短期目标。而现在这些地方官员即使被告知要支持经济增长，他们可能也会认为像过去那样大幅度的上马基建项目再扩大借债可能并不安全，而是采取适度的刺激措施，认为这才与北京现在的步调一致。因此综合这一些信息，更多的经济学家现在似乎得出了这样的结论：中国即使帮助企业，也会非常有针对性的帮助，即使是采取一些措施来提振消费者的情绪，也会采取有限的措施，而不是采取全面的刺激计划。当然，如果中国的情况再进一步出现恶化，甚至出现了明显的政治风险，所有这一切也可能推翻重来。比如 去年我们在讲到中国对于疫情的封锁的时候，其实当时基本所有人都已经死心了，认为中国可能只能等到全世界疫情过去之后才会放开，因为中央政府似乎已经笃定这是对于中国保障人民生命安全最安全、最稳妥的做法。结果出现了各种各样的抗议，这些年轻人喊出了自己的诉求，一夜之间就取消了疫情的封锁。一旦现在的经济困境真的是成为了某一种政治上的不稳定因素，这一切也有可能会改变。说到这一点我也要问一下和平先生，中国经济现在出现的问题，的确我们现在在海外可以说是隔岸观火，但是很多在中国现在就在中国做生意的这样的一些企业家，还有中国的一些刚刚毕业的在校学生，他们确实是感到了这一种痛苦。如果中国的经济形势不能够在短期内出现改善的迹象，信息不能够尽快恢复，这是不是有可能演变成为某一种对于习近平的政治压力，甚至是像疫情封锁3年之后出现的这一种走上街头的诉求？
我觉得民众走上街头是一个正常的一个表达情绪、表达痛苦、表达愤怒、表达要求的一个正当的行为。如果有这样的行为出现，而不是天天在网上喊躺平，或者说怎么样，还是好很多。情况有没有达到这样的程度，我们可以看，就算是有这些抗议示威出来，对现在的中共政权和对习近平来讲，增加了民间对他的怨恨，但是不会增加了政权的基本的威胁。原因很简单，在昨天的思想先驱报我们已经讨论了，全球化的民主转型过程中间的痛苦，使很多的国家转型成为开放和民主的社会之后，它的 GDP 反而是下降了，它的国家的动乱的情况反而增加了。如果我们回到1988年，我们认为政治体制改革比经济体制改革重要，经济发展不起来的根本原因是政治体制。那么经过了30-40年之后，那我相信很多的人有了更成熟的一种想法。今天的中国的变革把共产党干掉，那可能是符合大家的痛快的心理，把习近平请下台也是很多人所路径的事情。但是你的力量在哪个地方尤其是多少的民众真正是意识是支持你这种态度。所以我觉得呢，有可能如果经济继续恶化下去如果还有某一些领域某一些年轻人真的是走投无路，他们重新上街的可能性是存在的。但是这种情况和中文级时候的情况还是有很大的不同，国家的杠杆，国家的力量更强。何况是某一些调整是一种意味的一种可能性，比如说房价的下降。这个如果你是生活在这个纽约，或者是生活在香港，或者是台北，或者是尤其你生活在首尔，你就会知道一个房子对于一个城市的居民来讲那种压力有多大我早一段时间看到首尔的这个情况，好像已经达到70%了。收入的70%了。那么这种压力，如果你反而说中国房子下降，对于中国来讲是一个灾难，实际上你站在所有的角度来讲，它可能是另外一个角度看这个问题。那么对于年轻人的生活压力，对于新生的这个家庭，它可能意味就产生了这样一个开支的一个压力的释放。对于那些过去把资金或者是把希望寄托在去年我的房子涨了30%，明年我应该至少要涨个10%，结果不但没有涨，把去年还亏回来。其实你看看美国的房地产，它基本上每10年就发一次神经，它就会大跌一次，对吧？如果你挡不住，那你当然亏了；如果你挡住了，你基本上可以发现过几年以后它又回来了。然后我在美国30年就看了房子的各种各样的风波，最严重的就是结构性出现的次贷危机那一次，真的是很多人就上街了，住帐篷了，很多人甚至把房子已经付了5万、10万，甚至20万，甚至30万、40万的房子就抛掉了。为什么？因为那是有一个巨大的经济的杠杆。如果今天的中国的房地产只是房地产商的问题，只是流动资金的问题，或者只是你的预期的问题，而不是呢整个的经济像美国这样出现了一个结构性的一种黑洞，我觉得中国的情况比大家 可能感受的要好很多，好很多啊。那么就通过这些实际，你今天看起来可能房子过剩啊，也许再过几年看起来啊，那种过剩啊，也许呢并不是说完全没有用啊。就像昨天我跟李琦博士讨论一个问题，就是说你在20年以前吧，10几年以前，几乎每个都在骂中国的高铁。我不知道今天还有多少人在骂高铁，还有多少人在算你这个高铁什么时候才能回本呢？对吧？就像昨天啊，就是《华尔街日报》写到啊，这个贵州的这个机场的建设的问题啊，你就不是问我啊多少个机场啊，原来我还说是20个，结果还只有10几个啊。当然你从照片来看，只有2个人坐的这个按摩椅看起来，但是你看看未来。中国的这种对交通速度的这个需求会越来越强。美国的高铁、美国的地铁为什么荒废啊？就是因为当你的路途啊更长的时候啊，或者是呢，你发现呢，就像欧洲有些国家，现在我早一段时间也看到英国的文章，他说旺季吧，不要坐高铁，可以坐飞机。为什么？飞机更便宜。更准点啊，更千变啊，所以这个东西啊，你今天这么想啊，可能是一个就是这么回事，好像走不出来，而是明天看又是另外一番天地。我们怎么知道40年以前的中国人有一个房子，那简直是单位的领导对你最好的爱抚了。今天中国的房子居然是过剩。对吧？所以我的意思是说，很多的变化在无形中间，它就在调整和变化。你不可能让人永远把希望寄托在房子的无限制的增长。也许再过几年，的房子又会回来，这种可能性也不能排除。但是呢，你过去的这个预期有一点过分的单薄。中国的这些人呐，都是非常聪明的，都是灵活多变的，都是通过一件一件的事情积累了经验，积累了教训。毕竟中国经过了这种市场的冲杀，还只有了这个几十年时间，很长时间都是在中国的意识形态控制之下。所以我没有感觉到中国的经济像西方媒体所描述的这样，也没有像中国的朋友感受的这样。感受的不好的那些人确实是存在，相当的多，但是同时感受到很好的人也存在，只是感受到不好的人他没办法去理解，或者是愿意去看待那些正在非常努力拼搏的那些新兴企业的那些人或者没有注意到那些科技的企业的人，他们怎么不但在中国他们做得非常好，他们在欧洲、在美国、在很多的国家，他们呢做得不错我看看中国的基建，我们过去还说中国是烂尾工程，中国是不仅仅是烂尾工程，叫烂楼，就是随便就引你倒塌的工程对吧？但是你看看今天早一段时间，我看了美国智库的报告，全世界的水坝，中国在2020年就占了50%现在的比例有多大？全世界的港口，全世界的很多的交通，我看全世界能够找到最好的基金队就是中国的基金队了。你在几十年以前能够想象吗？所以我觉得看中国的问题吧，不是说它不严重，你看有些问题确实很严重，但是它国家比较大层次比较多，国家能量比较大人口也多，而且可以延换到了全球市场，所以很多问题也许在你躺平的时候，它就已经产生了另外一个变化。
好，谢谢何明先生的介绍那不知道您最近有没有去中国的经历？您所看到的中国的经济到底是现在我们所看到了的确情况非常的不景气，还是在这些不景气的里面，您又看到了一些光明之点也欢迎您与我们分享。感谢给我们打赏支持的观众朋友们，感谢麦团，感谢艺人，感谢散医生，谢谢这些观众朋友们对于我们的支持。明天同一时间，思想先驱报与您再会。
Very weak economic data out of China lately.
Yeah. To put it mildly,
I'm just starting very directly. No, the data has been very weak.
I have a collection of paraphrased headlines here. Oh. So we're recording this on August 16th, and we just saw an emergency rate cut from China. They also announced that they would stop publishing the urban youth unemployment rate, which is never a good sign.
When you just announced that a certain data point that people have been tracking for years suddenly will not be published anymore. Yeah,
exactly. And a particularly politically sensitive data point too. Retail sales are coming in extremely weak, so rising less than 3% a year. They used to be in double digits. We have deflation setting in, which is something we spoke about on the episode we did with Richard Koo. Manufacturing is contracting. Exports are falling. The yuan is dropping against the dollar. Bank loans at a 14-year low last month.
You really came prepared, Tracy.
I did. I know it's surprising, but I did actually.
I'm not surprised. I'm just impressed.
I did actually put together the data points because they're so startling. And again, if you compare it with all the excitement from earlier in the year about China reopening, the end of COVID-0, there was this expectation that China was going to end up being a positive catalyst for global growth this year. And instead, we are potentially seeing the exact opposite.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I think one of the theories is that there would be this big inflationary impulse globally from the China reopening, demand for steel, demand for various metals, obviously demand for oil and gasoline. And that hasn't picked, there has been this pretty mild, sort of mediocre reopening. It hasn't had that global shockwaves. If anything, people are talking about exporting deflation or disinflation. And then on top of all of the sort of like economic weakness that you bring up, there's also the sort of like financial market weakness. So there was just a story today about one of the companies that sells some of these wealth management products missing payments. There's obviously, I think it's a Country Garden, the big developer running into a lot of trouble, similar to the weakness we've seen in China Evergrande. So to your point, though, just this sort of slew of negative headlines.
Well, also, I think clearly there is concern that if you get real economic weakness in China, that could lead to something bad for the global economy, just in terms of real business activity. But I think there's also this financial channel that is probably the one that's likely to be the most problematic. So if you think about China as in many ways a giant hoarder of financial assets, the big question now is what are they going to do with those financial assets? Do they have to, for instance, start selling off some FX reserves in order to support the yuan? Are they maybe going to buy fewer US treasuries? So I think that is definitely one aspect of this that is really worth exploring.
So many interesting elements right now. We have to dive deeper into what is going on right now with the Chinese economy and what types of policy responses we might get or we might not get. I always see, there's like a furious debate always on Twitter. It's like, why doesn't the government just give more money to households? Sort of like the Richard Koo conversation, the sort of, got to boost domestic demand. What's the reluctance to do that? Like all these sort of different questions. So I think we really need to dive into them further.
Let's do it.
Well, I'm very excited because I think we have the perfect guest to discuss this. We're going to be speaking with Songwen Zoe Liu. She is the Maurice Greenberg Fellow for China Studies at the CFR. And she is also the author of a new book, Sovereign Funds: How the Communist Party of China Finances Its Global Ambitions. Thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots.
Thank you, Joe and Tracy, for having me. And I'm a big fan of the Odd Lots.
Very, very kind of you to say. Why don't we just start off like super simply? In your view, why hasn't China seen a more robust recovery since the lifting of the COVID restrictions?
Well, I would say that actually I have always been a contrarian.
Oh, good. I like this already.
In November last year, I put out a piece on foreign policy, basically made the argument to say that the zero COVID is the least economic challenging problem that President Xi Jinping was facing that day. And even the party, in this case, it would be the party, even if the party decided to remove zero COVID policy the next day, the economy won't sustain a robust rebound very quickly. And the reason comes from what I characterize as the 4Ds: demand, debt, demographics, and decoupling. At that time, it was decoupling, and now it's de-risking.
This is great. The 4Ds.
The 4Ds. It's like the 4Ds of the apocalypse.
Yeah, no, that's really, I feel like if you want to like have your thing, that's like a really demand, debt, demographics, and decoupling. I'm writing these down.
So really good. This is exactly what I wanted to ask you, because I remember even in 2018, 2019, there were concerns and a lot of discussion about a slowdown in China's economic growth. And then COVID happened and we sort of forgot about a lot of the structural issues that we had been talking about. And then lo and behold, in 2023, it feels like a lot of these structural problems are coming back to haunt the Chinese economy. Can you dive a little bit further into what those issues are?
Yeah, sure. I would argue that a lot of these structural problems, exactly as what you were describing, Tracy, it seemed that during COVID, we were, from both inside China and outside China, we were overwhelmed by the sudden pause of the economy because of the shutdown of factories and all that. And it seemed that temporarily, the pause of the economy covered up the structural problems that had been embedded into the Chinese economic growth model. And then once the party suddenly exit the zero COVID policy, given the consumption pattern that we have observed here in America or in Europe, people started to realize that, oh, okay, so this is a 1.4 billion market and people are going to spend, and that would be powerful and inflationary. And, but short-term revengeful expenditure would not necessarily overcome the long-term structural problems that have dragged the Chinese economy, even just from GDP terms. If we think about the Chinese economy, there are different ways that you can argue that the Chinese economy has peaked. I mean, I'm not necessarily that category, but if we just measure it from GDP perspective or in terms of export as a percentage of GDP, the Chinese economy already peaked. China surpassed Germany back in 2010 to become the largest trading or the largest exporting economy in the world, and has at its height, export as a percentage of GDP was about 30% and has since then plateaued and decreased. Right now it's about 20-something percent. And if you think about GDP growth, the double-digit growth period already ended. So from that perspective, what we actually observe goes back to the 40s. The problem with demand is not necessarily at, I'm not talking about the ultimate demand. I'm specifically talking about the household consumption component of demand. For a long period of time, yes, we can make the argument to say household consumption as a percentage contributing to the Chinese GDP is about 40%. It has been low and, global average. I'm not even talking about, the OECD level. I'm talking about like global average. It's about 60% of GDP, whereas China is 40%. We can make the argument to say, well, the household consumption has been a drag on the Chinese economy. However, up until 2012, by the end of 2012, actually household consumption's contribution to GDP growth at least has been on an upward trajectory. In other words, the growth of household consumption has been positive. You see Chinese people do discretionary vacations and all that. But that has changed since 2013. And if we just stretch it in between President Xi Jinping's 2 terms, the second term was even worse than the first term.
So let's go further into that. A, why has it gotten worse? And then B, there's all this talk. It's like, why don't they just do household stimulus or some version of that? And people are sort of bemused, maybe is the word. It's like, oh, why isn't the Communist Party more willing to extend support directly to the people in rebalancing things? A, why did it get worse? But why is there this reluctance to do something like what we did in the U.S., just sort of print money and give it to people?
Joe, that's an excellent question. You make me think about the why aspect of it, right?
Yeah.
So fundamentally, I would argue that there are 2 aspects of why there has been a decrease in household consumption. The first one is obviously you can empirically observe from the data, there has been a decline in household income growth. And household income growth up until President Xi Jinping, before President Xi Jinping came to power, household growth was income growth was significantly faster than after he came to power. And his second term was worse on average than his first term. So that's one aspect in terms of household income growth. And then the second aspect of it would be household balance sheet deterioration. And a lot of this comes down to housing market, property value depreciation because of control on real estate policies and all that. Now, the reason why there has been a reluctance in terms of basically provide stimulus checks to a Chinese household. Yeah. It's not that Chinese economists have not thought about that option. You actually do see people do that on Chinese social media when they realize that, oh, you know what, my cousins in America, they just they can just line up or wait in their house, and then mail would come in, get, like stimulus check. Some students were even getting stimulus check. And then the problem becomes, well, historically, there has not been this kind of precedent, but no precedent does not necessarily stop the government from inventing one, right? And the deeper problem, I would argue, is the politics. The politics simply would not necessarily work. Part of that is because empowering, this is probably deeper in the Chinese political philosophy in the sense that, well, it's depending upon which political scientists or political economists you are talking to, some people would say, oh, Chinese system is authoritarian capitalism or fragmented capitalism or fragmented authoritarianism and things like that. But fundamentally, what we observe is that the Chinese economic growth model has been built upon financial repression. And at the center of the financial repression are the Chinese banks. And who controls the bank is essentially the Chinese government led by the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party has always been at the center of capital allocation. And by empowering the household, or for that matter, the private sector, it basically dilute or potentially remove their relevancy.
Interesting.
This is exactly what I wanted to ask you. And I just did a thread on Twitter that made a similar point. But how much of this is a political economy problem in the sense that both on the business side and the consumption side, where we've seen the Communist Party be be controlling in many ways. So, for instance, on private business, we've had the property crackdown, the tech sector crackdown, and that would apparently seem to perhaps make people more reluctant to do their own startups and things like that. And then on the household side, it does feel like you have a reluctance from the party to sort of empower the individual at the risk of losing some of their own power and perhaps the collective power.
I am a political economist, so I would argue.
So the answer is yes.
Yes, you are right, Tracy. And from an intellectual perspective, I do think this is a political economy problem because if you look at the history of the Chinese economic growth since 1949, it's not that the economy has never experienced shocks. Actually, the Chinese system experienced a lot of shocks from even in the 1950s. The Chinese economy experienced the Great Leap Forward. And when the communists took over, they also destroyed a lot of the banking systems in Shanghai and elsewhere established by the imperialists, right? So, and then there was also Cultural Revolution and all that. But then there is also the sudden stop of the Cultural Revolution. In other words, the Chinese political economic system, A, is not short of crisis, or for that matter, man-made crisis. And secondly, the Chinese political economic system was also not unfamiliar with sudden reverse or sudden policy corrections. And what that means for today, that basically means the rapid growth of the Chinese economy has fundamentally been led by the government and the party. And it's just a degree of party-state involvement. Now, if we think about the rise of Deng Xiaoping, he corresponded to the rapid rise of China and all that. But if we remember what actually made China, the starting point of China's rapid growth was not necessarily, yes, it was 1978, the clear signal that China is reform and open up. But then there was Tiananmen, and China was put under sanctions and all that. And then 1992, he made this famous southern tour, he toured Shenzhen and all those places, and he gave a clear signal during his speech when he was touring the southern part of China. And I was just recently revisit his speech, so I remember this is something that I learned very recently, despite reading his speech so many times. So he cited this one example. This rich person, apparently he was one of the, if not the earliest, he was one of the earliest Chinese entrepreneur. to make 100 million yuan. He was the founder of this sunflower seed company called 傻子瓜子 or idiot sunflower seed.
Wait,
and
idiot
sunflower seeds, yes, or fool sunflower seeds, 傻子瓜子. And
what a name!
What a name! So at that time, out of jealousy or other reasons, there were some voices among Chinese people or policymakers to say, this guy becomes so rich, we need to take him down. And in his speech, Deng Xiaoping said, I'm aware of these kind of recommendations, but we cannot do that. He struck it down. And the reason, he also explained why the party cannot do that. He said, if we punished him, that would send a terrible signal. It would make people think that we changed our policy of reform and open up. And there are so many instances that we can do things and make people think we changed our policies. And we cannot do that. So from his perspective, the big risk, as he characterized it, is to make mistakes to make people think that we changed our policy.
Sort of, I don't know, maybe it's a devil's advocate question, or I don't know how I'd characterize it. But, obviously there's this big household debt overhang that you're talking about. It seems from the outside, and it seems from many commenters, like a pretty unhealthy real estate market in terms of the level of speculation, the level of costs, etc. It also seems as though the government would like to sort of find a way to get out of that trap where it's not all about, not everything revolves around the cost of housing or buying a new apartment. Is there an argument to be made that stimulus direct to households today under the current economic structure would just sort of further fuel a real estate bubble or real estate demand, and that until the sort of domestic economy has shifted in some way more such that it's not out of that dynamic, that it doesn't make sense to boost demand for those reasons?
First of all, I would say household demand for properties or for housing in China is on a perpetual decline for two reasons. The first reason is that from empirical data, we can observe that China's urbanization rate has peaked. And secondly, this goes back to one of the 4 Ds.
Oh, the third D here,
yes,
demographics.
Demographics. As of last year, Chinese population growth for the first time declined. And there are some numbers saying that actually now India's population is more than Chinese population.
Wow.
So and it's not just the population decline on its own, is not necessarily causing an immediate shock or negative shock on housing demand, but it's actually the lower family formation rate. And the idea that people for cultural reasons, it's very expensive to get married for fancy, banquet and all that. But, it's also very expensive to raise kids in China, especially in big cities. So those are the two structural reasons why demand for housing is on a perpetual decline in China. Even if the government gives stimulus checks to the Chinese household in the current mix of policy environment, I would not necessarily be confident that the Chinese household are going to be incentivized to spend, or B, think that this is a good time to buy a house. And the reason, there are two reasons. The first reason is negative confidence shock. And the second is a deflationary policy environment. And the negative confidence, part of that comes from, people's material feeling that their household balance sheet deteriorated, as being felt by the Chinese people as, well, I can empirically observe the value of my house went lower, and yet I am still paying a lot of mortgage. So you see, there is early mortgage payment, which the banks are not happy about it. And then on the other hand, as the Chinese GDP growth slows down, 3% last year, despite record high export last year. And then on top of that, we see the move out or the redistribution of global supply chains, and international multinationals become less, bullish about the Chinese market. Then, high-paying jobs there are less high-paying jobs being created. So Chinese people becomes like, well, wait a moment. I don't think I'm going to make more money. Therefore, they are not going to be incentivized to spend. They are going to be more incentivized to save, not because of good environment, but because of lack of confidence. And the deflationary policy environment is because people are waiting. Well, it seems that as from the beginning of this year, the government has put out so many policies to incentivize people to spend, or for that matter, support the housing market. And there is this popular saying, if you don't buy, if I don't buy, the housing price per square meter next week is going to be cheaper by 200 yuan.
Mm-hmm. So everyone goes on strike, right, to try to get a lower price. I think this is such a good point because historically, a lot of Chinese growth has been driven by infrastructure investment and housing. And it feels like infrastructure has kind of run its course. China does have a lot of great infrastructure right now. And at the same time, housing, the other sort of twin engine of growth, there are a lot of doubts about it, as you just laid out perfectly. I want to go back to something you said earlier. I've never heard anyone phrase it quite like this, but I think it's absolutely correct. The idea that the Chinese economy is sort of predicated on financial repression, and that introduces inherent limitations in a situation like this. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see that working?
Sure. There are so many people talk about financial repressions, and obviously people, Tracy, you are absolutely right. A lot of infrastructure and housing have been the twine growth engine for the Chinese economy because they drive up aggregate demand, and they also drive up global commodity prices.
Right.
And I would say that it's not that China built too much infrastructure, or for that matter, too much housing. It's that they overbuilt it to the extent that if population keep growing, or more international companies move into China, or there are more demand for factories because of entrepreneurs and all that, growing supply, growing demand. The whole idea is, this is the Chinese policymakers' mentality. As long as I build it, as long as I provided the infrastructure, they will come, right? But now the problem is, international companies are not coming for a variety of reasons. And a lot of the reasons goes back to my quote about Deng Xiaoping. Reason the Chinese leaders have simply made policy choices and policy decisions, created a huge uncertainty and signaled, even if they did not have the intention, but at least from our observation, they created the signal that perhaps the Chinese government or the party changed their policies with regard to reform and open up. So a lot of these boil down to, yes, the party is still very much at the center of capital allocation in this whole idea of financial repression. This whole idea is to use high savings that Chinese people tend to save. And this high savings is being channeled through Chinese banking system. And, the four biggest banks are state-owned. And through lower depositors rate, the banks are able to lend cheaply to support state-owned enterprises or channel credit to sectors that are prioritized by the government. And it's many people, who follows China, especially state-owned enterprises, they are familiar with this idea of the government has these guidelines or government guidelines for prioritized sectors. Every 5 years or so, they would update it.
Right. So we've talked about household demand. We've talked about debt. We've talked about demographics. There was actually a headline just yesterday in Reuters, China's fertility rate drops to a record low 1.09 in 2022.
The one headline I left off my list, Joe. You found it.
You had to save one for me. I appreciate that, which is so obviously still going, in the wrong direction. And I want to talk about the actual topic of your book, but I think maybe it is the fourth D in your 4D framework, the decoupling. And so obviously, I mean, I think there's some like sort of intuitions like, okay, like US or global multinationals maybe like less inclined to invest in China. Obviously, the sort of growing trade tensions that started under Trump and really have continued or maybe even ratcheted higher under Biden. But how do you think of that word decoupling? What does it mean to you? Like, how would you define it?
Honestly, I felt decoupling at the individual. First of all, Gerald, I appreciate that you asking me, how I felt about it, because people are very confused about what is decoupling or what are talking about de-risking. And there is actually no formal definition about what they are. At a personal level, the moment during COVID, the moment that I realized I cannot get on a plane from New York to go back to Shanghai or Beijing, for me, that is a sign of a decoupling. And right now there is, if I am correct, there is still no direct flight between New York and Beijing or Shanghai.
Huh. I didn't realize that.
And the flight, right now I think there are concrete policies that, concrete initiatives in the aviation industry between U.S. and China to increase the flight, but it's still way below pre-pandemic level. So we can concretely observe less and less people-to-people communication. And from economic sense, obviously, or political economy sense, decoupling obviously means, or for that, right now we're talking about de-risk, is very much a Western term if we view it from China or Chinese policymakers' perspective, because this is the term that they condemn a lot. You see Premier Li Qiang in the summer Davos in Tianjin said, decoupling is a terrible idea, is a false premises and all that. But decoupling really, I understand it from the perspective of supply chain diversification. The idea is really not about getting rid of China simply because China is on every part of your supply chain. How could you possibly get rid of China, right? But it's really about not being overly reliant on your one simple supplier. The whole idea of, Econ 101 used to be economy of scale, but now economy of scale become a risk.
Huh. That's very well put. Economies of scale becoming a risk.
So speaking of scale, why don't we talk about the sovereign wealth funds? Because when you look at the numbers of something like CIC, I mean, they're massive. With China, the numbers are almost always massive. The accumulation of this wealth and the fact that it is held by these public investment entities, what does that mean in times like this? China has, billions, possibly trillions of dollars worth of FX reserves. I can't remember the exact number. I think there's some debate over it now as well. But could they tap some of those assets to provide support in times of economic slowdown?
Tracy, that's an excellent point. In times of economic slowdown, I would say there are opportunities. But in times of economic crisis, they have done that before. And actually, China's sovereign funds initially was not created for geopolitical or geoeconomic aspiration, power projection. It was created out of a crisis. The very first time that the Chinese policymakers used foreign exchange reserves was to recapitalize the Chinese banks in the early 2000s when the major Chinese state-owned banks were crippled by non-performing loans. At that time, some of those banks were suffering from non-performing loans as higher than 20 or 25%. So by definition, they were non-solvent. So at that time, they decided that they created this special policy vehicle called Central Huijin and use foreign exchange reserves through Central Huijin to recapitalize these Chinese banks. They have been quite successful. Therefore, when there were a few, I think it's around 2015, if I remember correctly, there was this Baoshang Yinhang crisis. It's another medium-sized bank crisis in China. And a lot of confusion at that time. People were saying that, the central bank is going to take it over. Actually, it's not the central bank. It was Central Huijin. And now when a lot of these bad loan managers or bad debt managers or the so-called state-owned asset management company, a lot of them are in trouble now. And the idea is, I wouldn't be surprised, Huijin is going to step in and take them on its balance sheet, because this is a well-established channel that Central Huijin knows how to do it and do it successfully.
back further, I mean, you know, a lot of sovereign wealth funds around the world I associate with real commodity export countries. So obviously the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, one of the biggest, the various Gulf sovereign wealth funds, and they tend to be in large part about sort of currency stabilization, given the inherent volatility of GDP and their export channel. You mentioned, you know, the sort of origin of them and the banking crisis. Broadly speaking, what purpose do they serve for China, like currently, setting aside the current economic weakness?
Sure. And Joe, I appreciate that you mentioned the origin of the sovereign funds, right? Because a lot of these so-called sovereign wealth fund in the entire universe of a sovereign wealth fund, as Tracy mentioned earlier, you know, these funds are massive, and the Chinese funds are actually massive. CIC alone, it managed more than 1.3 trillion asset, which is larger than the size of Mexico's GDP. And I think Mexico is like the world's 17th largest economy or something like that. And China has more than that. So broadly speaking, despite that, yes, you know, originally these funds were, the first time that China did it was to solve a crisis. And then as China's reserve accumulation increased, or at least, you know, Tracy was right, there is a debate with regard to how we should think about the size of China's foreign exchange asset. But if we think about if we think about foreign exchange reserves using IMF's narrow definition, China's foreign exchange reserve was at one point peaked at $4 trillion. Right now, it's plateaued around $3 trillion, slightly higher than $3 trillion. Mm-hmm. And as China reserve accumulates faster and more, the debate in terms of how to better manage China's foreign exchange reserves started. And after President Xi Jinping came to power in particular, there has been a shift to strategically use the foreign exchange reserves to serve certain foreign policy agenda or to finance certain government initiatives, such as the creation of the Silk Road Fund to specifically advance or finance the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right. So I remember Brad Setzer recently, just on the debate over the size of FX reserves, Brad Setzer had a great piece of research about the possibility that maybe China has an additional $3 trillion, I think it was, worth of assets that aren't necessarily accounted for in official statistics. The idea being that if it hadn't channeled so much of that money into the Silk Road Fund or Belt and Road and programs like that, this would be an available pool of cash that it could use for other things. What is the political appetite, I guess, to move away from using that money to exert Chinese influence in other parts of the world, buy up commodities, things like that, build ports in Africa, whatever, versus maybe starting to channel some of it more domestically?
No, Tracy, that's an excellent point. Brad and I, we are colleagues, and somehow we have done independent research on similar topics and all that. His research has always been brilliant and solid. His charts are fantastic. And I sometimes would question the color coding aspect of it.
Oh, really?
But his charts are great. My estimation of the size of shadow reserves or whatever, you know, they are the assets, the foreign exchange assets that are not recorded on China's official foreign exchange statistics would be in ballpark in the same proximity to Brad's estimate. And in particular, for a lot of these assets managed by state administration of foreign exchange, you know, it established domestic and international investment corporations. And my assessment of to what extent this would be used to to project power globally, I would say perhaps in the current global geopolitical environment, not so much. And the reason is because this is perhaps another point where China's policymakers tend to think differently in terms of economic or financial management, diversification. it used to be that at least starting from 2007 to 2013, during this period of time, the discussion about diversification of foreign exchange reserves has been diversified away from U.S. treasuries because the yield on U.S. treasuries was so low and the opportunity for us to hold most of our reserves in U.S. treasuries is so high. Therefore, we need to diversify in strategic asset overseas, such as critical minerals, oil, gas, or, some startup companies and all that. And certain people even put out agenda in terms of these are the 6 areas that we need to think about in terms of strategic asset. But now diversification becomes a risk, because diversification cannot diversify away systemic risk, right? And for China at this moment, systemic risk becomes being sanctioned by the West.
Right.
This is my assessment. Obviously, I did not get this from Xi Jinping or anybody.
Sure.
But given the West collective sanction against Russia, especially the freeze of Russian reserves, now you realize, well, who has the largest foreign exchange reserve in the world? Well, it's China. And where are most of the reserve invested, or most of the assets invested or owned by sovereign funds? Most of the sovereign funds invest in Europe and America. They are not necessarily politically aligned or geopolitically aligned in times of geoeconomic contingency, such as Taiwan.
I think that's a very reasonable assumption. You actually brought up something that I wanted to ask you about as well, which is China's buying of U.S. treasuries. And there is a sort of perpetual concern that one day China is not going to be there to finance the U.S. deficit, I guess. How realistic is that concern in an era where China is potentially worried about something like sanctions?
To be honest, I'm not surprised that the appetite for China to slow down or buy less U.S. treasuries has already happened. Part of the reason is because the conversation has already started in the 2000s, and the people already realized, well, there is opportunity cost of holding U.S. treasuries. At that time, the opportunity cost was purely in terms of economic, but now the problem becomes perhaps there is also geopolitical risk.
Right. The diversification
aspect of it. And then the other aspect of the debate comes down to, well, perhaps China would not necessarily want to dump U.S. Treasury in large amount too fast either, because ultimately any volatility in U.S. Treasury market, or for that matter, the depreciation of U.S. dollar, is going to inflict a huge pain on the Chinese central bank's balance sheet as well.
So I just have one more question, and this is going to be one of those questions that's totally unfair because it's actually like incredibly open-ended. We could probably do another hour on this, but I mean, like, it's got to be like one question. But, the title of your book, How the Communist Party of China, or Sovereign Funds, How the Communist Party of China Finances Its Global Ambition. We've been talking a lot about the financing, but what are the global ambitions?
Like this is actually another episode.
I know it's a whole other episode or probably have a whole series of but I do think we should touch on that. Like, how would you summarize the global ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party?
I think the global ambitions have changed and evolved over time. It used to be the case that from Deng Xiaoping onward, up until 2013 or the end of 2012, the global ambition has been growing the economy, raising up the people's life standard, and so that the party can stay in power. And starting from 2013 and onward, we started to see there is an inflation of the party's ambition, from the Belt and Road Initiative to the building of shared human destiny. And a lot of these resonates with the current leader, President Xi Jinping's continued search for great ideas. And this brings me back to Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, in his 1992 tour, he said, it is okay for us to not have new ideas as long as we do not change with our economic reform and open up policy. But right now, the ambition seems to be changing, and it seems to be a moving target with regard to figuring out what exactly we are trying to do.
I need to come up with something like the 4Ds of something. Just like, I feel like a calling card on some big thing is like, it's so good.
Well, I'm glad you asked that last question about the ambitions of China, because I think it hints at the fundamental tension here, which, and Zoe mentioned this, which is for years, the party justified its control by promising economic growth. So you have that social contract. But I think the difficulty now is, what if that control is coming at the expense of economic growth? You know, if we're talking about a lot of these difficulties are in fact a political economy problem, then I think it raises that question and becomes extremely tricky for the party to actually navigate.
I hadn't really thought about that point before, about the sort of, I guess I would say, inherently decentralizing effect of more household demand, right? That at some level, if households have more cash, if they're less financially repressed, et cetera, then at some level, like, there's a limit of the degree of control that political leaders can have about that spending and where it goes and how that money is consumed. I hadn't really I sort of had this conception that, well, maybe for like domestic industrial purposes, you want to like prioritize the interests of certain exporters or certain industries, but just the idea of like an inherently like sort of like decentralizing effect is one that I hadn't thought about at all.
Well, and also it sort of highlights the importance of the public business entities in China. And this is something that I only realized from actually spending time in Beijing, which is, a lot of countries have big government buildings or monuments of some sort. A lot of the biggest buildings in Beijing are the CIC and the other sort of state-owned enterprises. And if you walk around the ring roads of Beijing, you get a real sense of their sort of monumental importance to the economy. There's physical evidence of it, which you can't really appreciate unless you see them. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting was the idea of more need for diversification in order to offset the decoupling aspect that Zoe talked about. But again, in times like this, where you need more money to support the domestic economy, but at the same time, you're worried about the external environment and you want to diversify away from the US to sort of offset that, that also seems really difficult to do.
I think that it does shine a huge light on that, because New York does make you examine yourself. And this is strictly from an emotional and mental perspective, rather than like a safety perspective first. But when someone does tell me, like, the first thing that comes out of their mouth of like New York, like, ooh, that's like dangerous, then I feel obligated on behalf of New York, to just be like, okay, wait.
He's not a good president. I don't know how he became president. I think the only way he becomes president, well, honestly, the way I saw it was like, I was walking around New York. Dude, this guy has like 6 Trump towers in New York. That's ridiculous. I didn't even know that. Like, I thought there was like 2, but there's like so many, and there's like one in like every major city in like the world. This guy's like a dude. He's connected.
欢迎您收看华尔街评论。诽谤法和生成 AI 谁对虚假言论负责？美国企业研究所。根据美国企业研究所的一篇文章，由生成式人工智能 AI 引起的诽谤责任应由技术的使用者承担，而不是 AI 公司本身。该报告认为，如果 AI 生成的信息是虚假的， AI 使用者将被视为诽谤信息的发布者，并将承担法律责任。然而，该报告还指出，如果 AI 模型生成虚假和诽谤性信息， AI 公司也可能面临诉讼。2022年，联邦对农场进行的工资和工时调查数量创历史新低。经济政策研究所。根据经济政策研究所最近的一项分析，美国政府在保护农场工人方面的执法努力在拜登政府下有所下降。该分析发现，美国劳工部工资和工时司 WHD 在2022财年的调查数量创下历史新低，仅有879起调查案件结案。这比特朗普政府任何一年都要少， 意味着每年不到1%的农业雇主受到调查。尽管调查数量很少，但 WHD 调查时发现的工资和工时法律违规行为占比达到70%。该分析还显示，在拜登政府任期内， HRA 签证计划的违规行为占到 WHD 所欠工资和罚款的近3/4。这与特朗普政府时期相比， HRA 违规行为仅占到所欠工资和罚款的大约一半。分析的作者建议采取几项行动来保护农场工人，包括增加 WHD 的资金，以雇佣更多的调查人员，通过一条通往公民身份的途径来保护非法移民农场工人，探索为非法移民农场工人提供工作许可的选项，并增加 HRA 工人的流动性。他们还建议 WHD 应将执法重点放在最有可能违反工资和工时法律的雇主身上，如农场劳工承包商和 HRA 雇主。红蓝美国之间的界限正在模糊，而不是变得更加坚固。纽约时报评论版。根据加利福尼亚居民作家杰西·内森的观点，农村和城市美国并没有像许多人认为的那样分裂。尽管红州和蓝州之间存在明显的政治分歧，内森认为这些地区的居民所持有的价值观并没有看上去那么极端。例如，内森将兰州的环保主义和对 LGBTQ 社群的支持与红州居民的价值观进行了比较。此外，他指出红州的价值观，如保护环境和自给自足，最初就是这些地区所持有的，但往往被兰州所忽视。内森还强调了城市价值观在农村社区中的增长。举例来说，马修·谢帕德在一个农村学院上演的谋杀剧和一个小镇的骄傲游行。内森最后得出结论，认为美国面临的种族主义和气候变化等问题太大，国家不能继续分裂，而且美国的交融和多样性远比表面看上去的要多。在阿拉巴马州，白色浪潮席卷而来。纽约时报评论版。阿拉巴马大学的女生联谊会招新活动，也被称为巴马招新，在 TikTok 上成为了全球现象。数百万人观看了白人女生联谊会成员通过同步舞蹈和协调服装来宣传自己的分会的视频。这些视频通过发型和口音等元素展示了传统女性特质，吸引了一个正在努力适应不断变化的性别规范的主流文化。然而，这些视频缺乏多样性，引发了人们对女生联谊会系统和整个美国南部的种族构成的质疑。阿拉巴马大学曾试图整合女生联谊会的招新活动，但大多数女生联谊会成员仍然是白人。女生联谊会系统在美国南部拥有重要的权力和影响力，使成员能够建立联系和社会资本。加入精英女生联谊会被视为解决多个问题的途径，包括组建大学同伴群体、建立 LinkedIn 联系人，并成为男生联谊会成员理想的伴侣。然而，这些女生联谊会的权利不在于姐妹情谊，而在于渴望她的兄弟会。希望使巴马招新多样化的愿望引发了对多样性商品化的质疑，以及真正的整合是否可能。阿拉巴马大学在整合方面一直存在抵制的历史，使得整合女生联谊会的想法显得空洞。女生联谊会系统可以通过表面的改变来标榜多样性，但真正的机会和权利无法通过加入女生联谊会获得。女生联谊会系统可能是过去的遗物，需要被抛弃。一个有趣的电影讲述了一个让我非常害怕的话题。纽约时报评论版。作者分享了他们尝试学习后空翻的经历，但由于恐惧和受伤而失败。然后他们讨论了如何使用机器学习技术创建了一个角色来学习后空翻。这个角色通过观察人类的视频并模仿他们的动作来学习。作者发现这既神奇又可怕，因为它与人类如此相似。这部纪录片探讨了野心、恐惧、控制和接受失败的主题。一个南东亚支付网络是值得努力的。日经亚洲评论版。汇丰银行亚太区全球支付解决方案联席负责人 Manoj Dugar 认为，印度和东南亚的实时支付网络将在未来5年内相互连接。Dugar 指出，该地区已经在建设实时支付系统方面取得了重大进展，例如泰国的 PromptPay、新加坡的 PayNow 和印度的统一支付接口 UPI， 这些系统已经在企业和消费者中得到了推广。这些网络已经开始相互连接。马来西亚和印度尼西亚允许使用二维码进行跨境支付，并在 PayNow 和 UPI 之间建立了链接。 跨区域实时支付网络的好处包括降低费用、缩短结算时间、改善风险管理和增加金融包容性。此外，该地区内的跨境支付将促进消费和商业活动，使企业能够国际扩张，并为消费者提供新选择。然而，建立这样一个网络是复杂的，需要决策者考虑资本管制、外汇要求、数据隐私和监管方法。国际银行可以在支持政府和促进支付系统整合方面。英国拥有太多的国家宝藏。英国电讯报评论版。作者对女子世界杯和演员布莱恩·布莱斯特在半决赛前朗诵3诗歌词的情况进行了反思。作者认为，国家宝藏的整个概念需要进行改革，建议这些人的任期应限制在20年，并应设立一个正式的国家宝藏登记册，每次只能有有限数量的成员。此外，作者还讨论了白噪音的流行趋势以及男性穿短裤时的时尚困境。紧邻乌克兰，莫斯科的控制力越来越紧。外交政策。俄罗斯试图在白俄罗斯、格鲁吉亚和摩尔多瓦建立主导地位，这是其在欧洲后冷战时期解决方案中推翻的一部分。这3个国家是前苏联的领土，他们摆脱莫斯科的独立，加剧了俄罗斯与欧洲的隔离。克里姆林害怕这些国家将寻求与欧盟和北约更深入的一体化，对俄罗斯的专制主义构成威胁。由于美国和欧盟对俄罗斯入侵乌克兰实施了严厉制裁，俄罗斯对这3个国家采取激进行动的边际成本有限。在白俄罗斯，俄罗斯计划到2030年完全吞并该国。白俄罗斯总统亚历山大·卢卡申科与普京对白俄罗斯身份的看法一致，并现Rishi Sunak 不是一个足够优秀的技术官僚。外交政策。英国保守党正面临政治叛乱，因为选民对现任首相里希·苏纳克的支持日益减少。欧洲的地缘经济革命。外交事务。近年来，欧盟 EU 经历了重大转变， 从经济相互依赖和严格规则的重点转向了更加地缘经济的方法。这种变化受到了多种因素的推动，包括 COVID-19 疫情的影响，来自中国和美国的日益激烈的竞争以及技术进步。欧盟的行政机构欧洲委员会在这一转变中发挥了核心作用，沃尔苏拉·冯·德莱恩主席带头推动。委员会已经采取了各种措施，为欧盟在更加封闭和竞争激烈的全球经济中做好准备，包括投资审查、反胁迫措施以及对政府采购和外国补贴的新规定。尽管这种地缘经济转变增强了欧盟在面对地缘政治挑战时的地位，但仍然存在一些障碍需要克服。成员国之间仍然存在分歧和紧张，特别是在财政政策和产业政策方面。欧盟还必须应对与中国的经济联系，这些联系错综复杂，难以解开。此外，欧盟在没有可靠的军事力量的情况下实现战略自主权也是一个重大挑战。尽管存在这些不确定性，欧盟已经展示了在不断变化的世界中适应和创新的能力。转向更加地缘经济的方法增强了该集团的凝聚力和应对地缘政治竞争的准备能力。欧盟在财政政策上的新灵活性和地缘经济工具的使用，使其成为全球经济的重要参与者，能够捍卫其战略利益和价值观。然而，这一转变的成功将取决于欧盟应对未来挑战的能力以及维持成员国的支持和合作。战败中的胜利，中国蒋介石的生平与时代 1887 至1975。外交事务。本文总结了亚历山大·潘佐夫的一本书，该书详细介绍了蒋介石作为中国国民党领导人的个性、人际关系和职业生涯。这本书借鉴了蒋介石的日记和俄罗斯档案，为他的生活提供了新的视角，并挑战了将他视为腐败的法西斯主义者或悲剧爱国者的传统观点。相反，蒋介石被描绘成一个专制民族主义者和革命者，在他的职业生涯中面临各种盟友的背叛。文章还强调了台湾蒋介石政权如何实施改革，为该国目前的民主奠定了基础。中国的海洋法，海洋秩序的新规则。外交事务。这篇文章讨论了彼得、达顿和瑞安·卡尔登关于中国对国际海洋法的态度的研究。该研究认为，与其关注中国是否遵守基于规则的国际秩序，我们应该关注中国如何利用或改变国际法以服务于自身利益。中国已经建立了一个机构来解释现有规则，并提出新规则，以加强北京的主张。这些解释经常与联合国海洋法公约相矛盾，并且不被其他国家接受，但中国仍然能够强行施加其法律主张。该研究认为，中国正在减少规则的重要性，而不是改变规则。无限制，中国与西方战争的内幕故事。外交事务。本文讨论了中国与西方关系的恶化及其背后的原因。作者指出，对中国的不安始于2010年左右，当时中国政策制定者认为全球金融危机改变了力量平衡，使他们有了争夺全球霸权的动力。西方国家，特别是美国和日本，开始感到担忧。欧洲国家的反应较为迟缓，但最终中国在推广自己的信息基础设施组建以及在 COVID-19 大流行期间的行为，使欧洲国家一致认为中国的行为威胁到了欧洲的安全。最后一根稻草是中国在2022年2月乌克兰入侵前推动与俄罗斯的关系。作者在过去10年间游历西方和亚洲国家时，曾对中国与西方的融合持乐观态度，但目睹了这一历史性逆转。现在，西方希望与中国保持距离，因为中国在欧洲经济和信息系统上实现主导地位，并有可能分裂大西洋联盟的野心被视为过于激进和过早。交接，乔治 ·W. 布什的外交政策传给巴拉克·奥巴马。外交事务。这篇文章讨论了由前美国总统乔治 ·W. 布什的国家安全顾问史蒂芬·哈德利编辑的一本新书。这本书包含了布什政府的过渡备忘录的解密文件，提供了对政府的关注点和政策决策的洞察。1/4的备忘录涉及反恐战争和总统的自由议程。这本书并没有提供布什外交政策的平衡历史，对伊拉克的处理也有限。然而，这本书确实提供了对当时高级官员思维的宝贵洞察，并促进了政府的透明度。 海湾阿拉伯国家的经济国家战略，在中东北非地区部署援助、投资和发展。外交事务，在过去的15年里，海湾国家一直利用其经济实力，在中东、北非和巴基斯坦地区扩大影响力。他们的援助、贷款和投资帮助他们超过美国、欧洲和国际金融机构，成为这些地区的捐助者和投资者。中国和海湾国家都在输出一种国家资本主义和威权主义的模式，这与西方推崇的自由市场和自由民主不同。这对华盛顿推动的经济秩序构成了挑战。
So last Friday kicked off the Trilateral Leaders Summit at Camp David we spoke about last week. President Biden met with Japanese Prime Minister Kishida and South Korean President Yoon. Biden has called for a new era of cooperation in response to the threats posed by North Korea, but in particular a rising and increasingly aggressive China. Announcements after this summit included a new commitment to consult one another, in particular the formation of a three-way crisis hotline, a commitment to conduct annual military exercises and share intelligence, and the continuation of meetings like this one with a new annual trilateral summit. Miles, what are your reflections on this summit? How momentous is this as a step diplomatically and for the security of our allies in the region? Is there anything that surprised you or that you expected to come out of this that didn't?
It didn't surprise me. Yeah, it did surprise me in a way, because the cornerstone of peace and stability in Northeast Asia is this tripartite alliance. Led by the United States, includes Japan and South Korea, has been going on for over 7 decades. So it's very important. However, there is the issue there that is it's fundamentally bilateral alliance system. In other words, it's U.S. Japan and U.S. Korea. Japan and Korea themselves do not have a mutual defense arrangement. So that's created very interesting dynamics. So none of the issues you mentioned earlier in the White House readout about the joint exercise, sharing intelligence, and all those things, none of this is new, because it's been there all these years. United States was conducted a joint drill with Japan and also with Korea, and also not on a regular basis, more or less. So this Camp David summit is very important because for the first time to bring Japan, South Korea together in Camp David to reach a deal. And President Biden said he wants to institutionalize this arrangement. In other words, it becomes sort of a trilateral rather than bilateral. So the three now act together to pursue same agenda of security for peace. So that's why it's very important, because Korea and Japan, for historical reason, for leadership, statesmanship reason, there have always been some kind of a trivial arguments, disagreements on history, on mutual export control, and that has escalated to points of crisis throughout the decades. It's very unfortunate that this very important defense alliance led by the United States has this kind of internal division between Korea and Japan. So this is for the first time, two leaders come to Camp David and transcend trivial disagreements and for the better purpose of self-protection. What really united all of the three is really about China. You mentioned very, very clearly. Both the United States and Japan have stated in their official documents that China constitutes the #1 national security threat to both countries. Korea has not said in such explicit way, because Korea is right next to North Korea, so which is also a sort of a source of instability. But the president of South Korea, President Yoon, is a visionary. He has said repeatedly, China problem is not really a regional problem. It's like a Korea problem. It's a global issue. So there's a global vision there. So I think this Camp David meeting has the sort of resemblance of the Camp David Accord of 1970s brokered by the United States, and finally bridge the two adversaries in the Middle East between Israel and Egypt. It will have a very long-lasting impact in regional security. it may also pave the way for this fundamental transformation of American-led alliance system in the Indo-Pacific. That is, to transform the existing bilateral relationship to a multilateral collective NATO-like defense pact in the Indo-Pacific. I can clearly see in the near future, Korea and Japan would also sign some sort of mutual defense agreement. In other words, an attack on either will be constituted attack on both. That will bring the United States in. Having said this, if you read the White House announcement very carefully, President Biden, right after the Camp David summit, announced that he's going to visit Vietnam. That's another very important step toward America's global strategy, particularly the Indo-Pacific strategy, because Vietnam is at the front line of countering the China threat. No country in Indo-Pacific has been involved in more military conflicts than Vietnam with China in the last half a century. So this is a very important development in my view.
I want to press on something you said at the beginning there that, at least at the bilateral level, a lot of this cooperation is not necessarily new. Some commentators have framed the Biden administration's approach and this summit in particular as a reinvigoration of the U.S. alliance system following what they perceive as the tumultuous Trump years. Having been in the last administration yourself, could you speak to what our relationship with these allies was like during the Trump era? Is it fair to call this a tumultuous time, or did the last administration lay some of the groundwork that culminated in this retreat?
I mean, the charges are largely based on emotion. Yes, President Trump has said something that's not really constructive to alliance confidence building. But in the end, the previous administration did a lot more in securing commitment to mutual defense in Asia Pacific, even in Europe as well. Yeah, look at what happened to NATO, right? NATO has reinvigorated itself in terms of its commitment to the alliance. And I think, timing is very different. At the time when we set China as the #1 national security threat, most of the world were not with us, including our friends and allies in Asia and in Europe. And we have to work really, really hard to bring me into this kind of understanding. And gradually, by the time the Trump term was over, most countries actually have come to that agreement. But it was really difficult to work with. I'm very glad that the Biden administration continued our policy toward global strategy. That is, we continue to treat China as a #1 national security threat. That fundamental has not changed. So I think the issue really is about bipartisan. And also, I think the Biden team is able to work much better with our friends and allies based upon what we worked really hard to build up this kind of global consensus on China. The consensus was not completed at the time when we left office, but the foundation was laid for the success of the Biden administration.
And just one last question on this summit. In response to the summit, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman Wang Wenbin said, no country should seek its own security at the expense of other countries' security interests and regional peace and stability, and added that the Asia-Pacific region should not be, quote, turned into a wrestling ground for geopolitical competition. Miles, what is your response to Mr. Wang's statement?
That's a very anemic statement. It's typical of PRC's age-old gobbledygook. It really doesn't have any persuasive power whatsoever. It assumes that all the countries that have a problem with China are manipulated by the United States. They are the puppets of the United States. They completely disrespect sovereign decisions by countries like Japan, Korea, Australia, Vietnam, India. They all believe everything. Every time those countries have a problem with China, they are basically agitated and abetted by the United States, by Washington, D.C. This is a really, really sort of myopic and is very untrue. And I think most countries do not take China's statement very seriously. It's age-old propaganda that it really does not mean anything nowadays.
For our next topic, this past weekend, President Biden issued an executive order banning U.S. investments in China's technology sectors, including semiconductors and microelectronics, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence. The aim is to ensure U.S. companies are not assisting or facilitating Beijing in gaining an advantage by developing technological applications which could pose national security risks to the U.S. and its allies. The ban applies not only to China, but its special administrative regions like Hong Kong and Macau. And this comes in conjunction with a series of export controls on high-end semiconductor chips going to China. This action has largely been praised, although some congressional members have noted it should have gone further. In particular, Representative Michael McCall from Texas, who chairs the House Foreign Affairs Committee, said, while he was pleased with this, that it should have included restrictions on investments in biotech and energy as well. What is your estimation of these recent steps taken by the Biden administration?
I think it's a step forward, and I'm actually pleased to see the announcement. And it's a very similar pattern, right? When we were handling the China issue, and I think we got the criticism from the Democrats. It said we're not doing enough to curtail China's ambition and China's aggression. So here you see the same pattern again, when the administration in power is doing something that's correct, and then the Republicans say that you should do more. I mean, but I think, this is not a real criticism. It's just like some kind of a further agreement on the fact that China is really a big threat to the United States. I think this executive order focuses on the right groups, that is private equity firms and the venture capital investment banks, particularly big banks that have a huge dealings with China like BlackRock and Goldman Sachs. It tries to seal off a loophole in export control. We already have a very strict export control in banking industry, for example, in some of the industrial manufacturing firms. They're heavily regulated, but not on private equity and venture capital investments in China. This is a huge loophole. And I'm sure, those groups were not going to be happy. I remember that they actually came to Washington, D.C. to lobby the White House to make it easier for their transaction with China. In reality, this actually may help those firms because they can now tell the CCP, hey, listen, to bug off and by citing the U.S. federal ban. So it's not a real responsibility not to reinvest in China's critical industry like chips, semiconductor, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. It's the U.S. government. So that's the way that should be, because I always say Twitter's problem should never be just Twitter's problem with China. Twitter's problem should be America's problem with China. The same logic would apply. You mentioned about the ban that also includes Hong Kong and Macau. This is hugely important because Hong Kong play a very important role in transactions in high tech and the electronics import and export in and out of China. Over 70% of all transactions in high-end electronics into and out of China are going through Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is a hotbed of China's state-sponsored illicit operations on massive scale, either through rogue banks such as HSBC or Hong Kong's unique financial ties to the free market system to conduct anti-market activities by China, such as money laundering and other schemes on a massive scale. So Hong Kong's role as an accomplice to CCP regime should be severely punished. And I think this executive order aims precisely at that. My only criticism of this executive order, however, is this. It places the major role of implementation of this executive order on primarily the Treasury Department, which I think is not the best agency, because Treasury Department is heavily susceptible to Wall Street influence, particularly private equity firms and venture capital sectors, the very sector this executive order is aimed at. So I would prefer it to be handled by the White House, State Department, DOD, or even Commerce, but not Treasury, based upon my own experience in my service in the government.
Last topic, we have a new anti-corruption campaign from Xi Jinping, this time focused on the PRC's healthcare sector. It has been described as the biggest crackdown on corruption in the history of the industry in China. Over 170 hospital executives and CCP secretaries have been placed under investigation so far. I'll cite a few examples which seem to have motivated this. One, a hospital in the southwest province of Yunnan bought radiotherapy equipment for over double its import price, with the hospital director pocketing the difference. And another, a plastic surgeon in Jiangsu, was arrested and 40 million yuan in cash was found in his home. In general, the medical sector is seen as being especially corrupt in China. Miles, could you open this up a bit for our listeners? How widespread is this really? And if you could, I'd like to ask if you could connect this to what you mentioned last week when we talked about the economic troubles facing China. You mentioned that without being able to speculate on land as they normally would, the government is going after the rich for funds, in particular in hospitals and in the emigration consultancy industry. To what degree are the party's actions here simply financially motivated?
Many people have said, the corruption in the hospital sector is nothing new. It's been there for decades. Why now? Because right now, China has this, a money crunch. The government needs money to finance different levels of its operations. And hospital is where the money is, so that's why they went after it. You can see the scale, right? As of now, there were close to 200 hospital heads and the party secretaries have been investigated, and many of them were arrested. Billions and billions of yuan have been returned. The Chinese government vowed to go back to the books of many hospitals 20 years. So you can imagine how much money the government can extract from the hospitals. Now, every time you think about the anti-corruption campaign in China, you always see this as some kind of pretext to cover up some of the underlying institutional reasons for the corruption. China always go after the symptoms of corruption, but never the roots of the corruption. Of course, there is this phenomenon of population aging. With the aging population in China, you have a lot of older people who needs medical treatment. So that gives the hospital a lot of power. Doctors in China are a very important group of people. They can save lives, and they can also make your life miserable. It all depends on how you regulate and how the system is set up, right? In China, there's some systemic flaws that make hospital very, very likely to be corrupt. For example, you have this inadequate health insurance. China's health coverage actually is quite widespread, but the insurance coverage is not really enough. When you have a major operation, when you need hospitalization, it's never enough. So that's why people have the extreme anxiety. And if doctor says you have this problem, you really have no other way just to pay up, right? More fundamentally, I think it is a government spending priority. The Chinese government actually spend a lot of money on healthcare, but over 80% of PRC's enormous healthcare spending is on the tiny group of CCP senior cadres. They set up special hospitals, almost like a resort-like and sanitarium-like hospitals with guards and walls. The hospitals that service the majority of the Chinese population are grossly underfunded. China's central government's healthcare spending on those hospitals serving the masses is about 10% of all the hospitals' expenses. So in other words, hospitals in China were responsible for 90% of their operational cost. Therefore, you have this gigantic incentive for corruption. Many hospitals are giving doctors even quota for profits. You have to make some money. How do you make profits? If you're a doctor, you can easily prescribe some medicines, very expensive, but not necessarily the best, right? Or you can recommend operations that are not necessary, but very costly. That is where money and the corruption started. So I think the government healthcare spending priority is the institutional problem. There's also this peculiar phenomenon of Chinese medical system. In the United States, more or less that hospitals and the pharmacies are separated. You go to see a doctor gives the prescription, and normally you go to the local pharmacy, which is unconnected with the hospital. China is different. The Chinese hospitals are normally the same as a pharmacy. So this basically gives this pharmaceuticals enormous opportunity to influence doctors, to bribe doctors to use their drugs for profit. So there is a commercial reason for that. And this is a really, really institutional and a systemic problem. I have to say this, though, despite all this corruptions going on, I have seen some Chinese doctors and nurses. They're doing amazing job. They're taking care of the nation's patients, and they're doing really, really sort of yeoman's work. But again, the system is so inadequate, shall we say, and to create all these very unfortunate conditions for corruption to emerge and to thrive and to become so widespread. It's a very tragic story to look at all the things. And this, by the way, has created enormous national anxiety because many people do not trust the integrity of the healthcare system. Therefore, if you are desperate, you basically would voluntarily bribe the doctor in hope of getting the best treatment. And that also is another thing. So it is a public trust, the lack of which in China, and not really created this problem of corruption and makes it even worse. And this is also politically destabilizing for Chinese government because so many people are so afraid of getting sick, particularly getting some kind of chronic diseases. They believe in some kind of a magic power, some kind of a crack approaches, and really become very, very serious political problem because you have secret societies, you have some kind of the swindlers doing some terrible things to the people. So that is also a problem. It's kind of vicious cycle. So it's very unfortunate. Most important thing is to really establish public trust and credibility of the most critical group of people in the society, that is doctors, nurses, and because they can heal not only the people, but also the society.
Welcome to this video report on FISA 702, a pivotal section of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, that's FISA. In this report, I'll explain what FISA 702 is, how it operates, the controversy surrounding it, and the ongoing debate about its reauthorization. So what is FISA 702?
Section 702 is the law that enables the United States government to obtain intelligence by targeting non-Americans who are overseas and who are using U.S.-based communication services.
At its core, FISA 702 is a provision within the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that allows the U.S. government to collect intelligence on foreign nationals located abroad without requiring a warrant. FISA was originally signed into law in 1978. Section 702 is a section of Amendment 7 to FISA, which was signed into law in 2008. Included in Amendment 7 is a sunset clause that states when the amendment will expire if it isn't reauthorized. Amendment 7 has been reauthorized twice, once in 2012 and once again in 2018. It will expire on December 31st of this year if it is not reauthorized again. Importantly, within Amendment 7 to FISA, there are also Sections 703 and 704, which allow for the collection of communications of U.S. citizens reasonably believed to be located abroad. Following Edward Snowden's leaks of classified documents exposing how FISA was being used to mass collect Americans' data without warrants, and later following the 2017 FBI investigation Crossfire Hurricane, which used FISA warrants to collect evidence on Carter Page, who the FBI suspected of being a foreign agent for Russia, there's been a concerted effort towards creating transparency around how FISA is used to collect communications, and also an effort to increase transparency around how Americans' communications are being collected within FISA 702.
All right, so the good news is that at its very core, FISA's privacy and oversight framework is designed to do exactly that, to sustain public confidence through rigorous and regular scrutiny by all three branches of government.
This transparency has mainly surrounded the bureaucratic process around how FISA is used, the checks and balances in the system to prevent misuse, but it also gives a degree of insight into how the system works. Before intelligence agencies can collect communications under 702, the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence must submit certifications to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, a special court created expressly for the purpose of reviewing whether surveillance agencies are violating FISA law. These certifications describe how each intelligence agency plans on collecting communications, and also what category of intelligence is being collected. The Director of National Intelligence report explains these categories must meet the statutory definition of foreign intelligence information. Certifications have included information concerning international terrorism and other topics, such as the acquisition of information concerning weapons of mass destruction. Certifications must be submitted once a year, and the FISC can approve all the certifications together in one order. The key problem here is that once the FISC has approved the Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General's certifications, intelligence agencies are free to collect communications en masse into their databases without oversight from the FISC. To collect communications into databases, an analyst identifies a target's selectors. Those are phone numbers or email addresses or IP addresses, and compels private U.S. companies to share all the communications associated with those selectors with intelligence agencies' databases. This capitalizes on how much of the world's internet infrastructure goes through the U.S. or is maintained by U.S. companies.
How do we look at the private sector differently? How do we actually leverage this idea of, hey, the private sector has an incredible amount of power?
There are two programs of collection. Upstream is exclusive to the NSA, which can compel U.S. companies that maintain internet infrastructure, so server farms, internet cables, Elon Musk's Starlink satellites, to share targets' communications that pass through their infrastructure. Downstream is the second program, and it's available not just to the NSA database, but also to the CIA database, the FBI database, and the NCTC, that's National Counterterrorism Center database. And it allows these agencies to collect communications from the private companies that maintain the target's account. To fully understand the scale of surveillance, here's a list of American companies that service accounts and are compelled to share data with the government through the downstream program. Apple, and therefore all messages sent on the Messages app on iPhones, Mac computers, and Apple Watches. Google, and therefore Gmail and all Google Drive services. Facebook, and therefore WhatsApp, Instagram, and Messenger. Amazon, which owns Amazon Web Services, which provides cloud computing services for many international companies. Microsoft, and therefore Outlook, Skype, and all of Microsoft's cloud computing services. And Zoom.
So let me pause here and offer a couple of hypothetical scenarios in which 702 could prove crucial, to put some specifics on the table. Suppose the FBI gets information that an individual overseas, someone overseas, appears to be recruiting employees of a U.S. semiconductor company, possibly for the purpose of gaining access to sensitive U.S. technology for military purposes. An analyst at the FBI, with that information, could target that overseas individual's email under 702, and this would help us figure out what technology they may be seeking to take, whether it might be used to advance that country's military. That's one example. A second is, suppose a foreign partner tells us that an overseas individual is attempting to sell weapons to a rogue nation that's under U.S. sanctions. We get that information from a foreign intelligence partner. Under 702, we could move quickly to acquire that overseas individual's communications, to gather more intelligence about his or her activities, who that person's dealing with, even if there was not probable cause to believe that that person was acting as an agent of a foreign power. A third hypothetical. Suppose a foreign partner captures a terrorist on the battlefield, not an uncommon scenario. That person who's captured on the battlefield has a phone, and our foreign partner gets a list of email contacts from that terrorist's phone. With that information, with that list of email addresses, intelligence analysts here, our intelligence analysts, could use 702 to gain insights about other people that terrorist is in contact with, understand that network, and that would help us disrupt ongoing or future plots.
Intelligence agencies cannot search their databases of communications with keywords or names, and instead have to search by identifiers. Those are email addresses or phone numbers or IP addresses. In their efforts To create transparency, the Director of National Intelligence Annual Report in 2023 has revealed that U.S. citizens' identifiers were used as queries more than 8,400 times in 2022. These U.S. citizens' communications were collected because they were in communication with some of the more than 240,000 targets whose communications were collected in 2022. Targets are individuals whose email addresses or phone numbers have been used to have their communications collected. Queries are individual searches through the database of collected communications. Here are some case studies and controversies surrounding the reauthorization of FISA 702. In the 2017 FBI investigation into Carter Page, the FBI made 17 errors or omissions in its applications for FISA warrants from the FISC. This has caused Trump allies and supporters to accuse enforcement agencies of having a bias against Trump. It was also found that the FBI misused its database in 278,000 searches over the course of several years, including in its investigation into Black Lives Matter protesters in 2020. The American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, criticizes Section 702, saying that though Section 702 is justified as a counterterrorism tool, in reality it permits surveillance far beyond what is needed to protect national security. It allows the government to target foreigners abroad if it believes they possess foreign intelligence information, a term so broadly defined that it can include ordinary information about foreign affairs that has nothing to do with national security. This means that targets of surveillance could include human rights defenders, journalists, whistleblowers, or business owners. The government collects the personal information of these individuals, including any communications they may have with people in the U.S., and stores it in databases for years, and in some cases indefinitely. Given our nation's history of abusing its surveillance authorities and the secrecy surrounding the program, we should be concerned that Section 702 is and will be used to disproportionately target disfavored groups, whether minority communities, political activists, or even journalists. Part of the problem with 702 is that while there is now more transparency surrounding how the bureaucratic processes of how 702 searches are approved by the FISC, the way the intelligence agencies determine who qualifies as a target is unclear. In the government's eyes, are Black Lives Matter protesters a threat to national security? What about climate activists in the UK or Germany? It's also worrying given the rising tensions between China and the US, especially in news stories about Chinese police stations outside of China. Does the US government see Chinese immigrants abroad as foreign agents that may be affiliated with these police stations? These questions remain unanswered because of the opacity of the program. Assistant U.S. Attorney General Matthew Olson and General Nakasone have both described how 702 prevented several threats from China.
Today, we are relentlessly focused on serious threats, such as the Chinese government's efforts to spy on us and to steal our sensitive technologies, Iran's sanctions evasions, North Korea's nuclear program, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let me stress the threat we face from China in particular. At this moment, when China is ramping up its efforts to spy on Americans, we must not blind ourselves to that threat by allowing 702 to expire.
There is a scope, scale, sophistication that we ascribe to what China is doing today. Are they getting better? Yes. But I think the question always comes back to us as we think about this, how do we address it? And what are our competitive advantages against a nation that has so much scope, so much scale, and increasing sophistication? Well, I think it begins with this idea of our competitive advantages are, first of all, being able to understand what our adversary is doing. You mentioned intelligence gathering. You mentioned this idea of, utilizing different capabilities to spy on us. Certainly we have to address this. I am very concerned, and we are addressing the issues that we made public in May of this past spring about China living off the land, this idea of positioning themselves in different critical infrastructure elements of the United States, our allies, our territories, to perhaps utilize in the future. Why are they doing that? Why are they in our critical infrastructure?
Most subjects of 702 surveillance don't know that they're being surveilled. If they do find out, they have no legal rights to challenge the legality of surveillance. As the expiration date of Amendment 7 looms, a debate rages. Proponents, including figures like General Nakasone and Assistant U.S. Attorney General Matthew Olson, stress FISA 702's importance in national security. Critics like the ACLU call for reform, pointing to concerns about warrantless surveillance and the misuse of collected data. In conclusion, FISA 702 is a complex framework that intertwines national security, privacy, and accountability. As Amendment 7 faces reauthorization, the discourse around its efficacy and ethical implications remains at the forefront of legal and civil rights discussions. Thank you for watching this comprehensive report on FISA 702. If you want to learn more, you can find the Director of National Intelligence annual report linked in the description below. Please like, share, and subscribe for more informative content.
欢迎您收看《华尔街网报》。现场市场，政府借贷下降，引发人们对亨特能否实现减税的希望。最新消息更新。英国每日电讯，英国政府在财政年度的前4个月的借款低于官方预测，这可能使财政大臣杰里米·亨特有可能减税。4月至7月的预算赤字为566亿英镑，784亿美元，比预算责任办公室3月份的预测少113亿英镑。仅7月份的赤字为43亿英镑，低于经济学家预测的50亿英镑。然而，总债务达到 2.58 万亿英镑，占国内生产总值的 98.5%。自疫情爆发以来，除法国外，增长速度超过了欧盟其他国家。澳大利亚派遣其最大的战舰参加与菲律宾和美国的联合军演。南华早报。澳大利亚最大的军舰堪培拉号加入了与菲律宾和美国在有争议的南中国海进行的联合演习。这些演习旨在加强防务关系，以应对中国在该地区日益增长的军事存在。中国已经派遣了数百艘海岸警卫队、海军和其他舰艇在争议水域巡逻和军事化岛礁，尽管国际裁决认为其主张没有法律依据。这次联合演习涉及来自澳大利亚和菲律宾的2000多名军人，以及150名美国海军陆战队员。美国、日本和澳大利亚本周还将在菲律宾附近举行联合海军演习。一部传记考察了被尊敬和被唾弃的华裔美国明星黄柳霜。纽约时报。黄云特 Young Huynh 是加州大学圣塔芭芭拉分校的作家和英语教授，他写了一本关于华裔美国女演员黄柳霜 Anna May Wong 的传记。黄云特的书名为《龙女儿 Daughter of the Dragon》，探讨了黄柳霜在面对反华情绪时的生活和成功。黄柳霜于1905年出生在洛杉矶，20世纪30年代和40年代在好莱坞面临许多挑战和刻板印象。尽管面临重重困难，他作为首位华裔美国好莱坞明星取得了巨大的成功。黄云特的书在黄柳霜的生活和遗产再度引起关注的时候出版，未来还将有其他书籍和电影以他的故事为基础发布。黄云特的书是关于亚裔美国文化偶像的3部曲之一。他之前的作品关注了虚构侦探查理、陈 Charlie Chang 和原始的暹罗双胞胎恩格和昌克邦克 In and Chang Bunker。黄云特选择了具有复杂和有争议的遗产的主题，因为他认为探索这些复杂性有助于他更深入地了解美国文化。黄柳霜在亚裔美国历史上既受到崇敬又受到唾弃，因为有人认为她延续了亚洲女性的刻板形象。黄云特成为一名英语教授和作家的旅程是一次文化探索之旅。他于1969年出生在中国，并于1991年移居美国。他经历了1989年天安门广场抗议活动的政治动荡，这促使他离开中国，并在美国继续接受教育。黄云特自己的文化融合经历以及亚裔美国人面临的挑战，影响了他决定写关于亚裔美国文化偶像的作品。总的来说，黄云特关于黄柳霜的传记揭示了一位开创性的华裔美国女演员在好莱坞面临的众多挑战和刻板印象。他的书是对黄柳霜故事更广泛兴趣的一部分，该故事正在其他书籍和电影中探索。通过他的作品，黄云特旨在加深对美国文化和亚裔美国身份复杂性的理解。朝鲜国际航空公司的飞机降落在中国，这是朝鲜商业航班在3年内的首次。 南华早报，一架从平壤飞往北京的客运航班已经降落，这是自2020年朝鲜因新冠疫情关闭边境以来，首次有关于朝鲜的商业航班。这架航班由朝鲜国有航空公司高丽航空运营，于周二早上抵达北京。中国今年早些时候放宽了疫情限制，并批准了两国之间的定期航班计划。目前尚不清楚这架航班上有谁，但有人猜测可能是接回在疫情期间无法返回朝鲜的朝鲜公民。解释：柬埔寨新领导人洪曼德，强人还是改革者？路透社，洪曼娜被任命为柬埔寨新任总理，继承了他父亲洪森近40年的统治。洪曼娜是洪森5个孩子中最年长的一个，接受了特权教育，包括在纽约大学获得硕士学位和在布里斯托大学获得博士学位。他在柬埔寨军队中迅速崛起，并被宣布为他父亲的继任者。洪曼娜将成为何种类型的领导人尚不清楚，但各大强国将密切关注他是否会维持威权现状，还是追求民主改革并改善与西方的关系。卢比微涨，但美国收益率被视为主要阻力。路透社，尽管存在对美国收益率的担忧，但印度卢比对美元略有上涨，尽管预计不会取得显著收益。印度储备银行可能进行了干预，使卢比保持在一个狭窄的范围内。Quantard 市场解决方案的董事总经理 Srinivas Puni 表示，卢比已稳定在83对美元左右，但风险正在积累，等待催化剂。投资者还在关注本周晚些时候美联储主席杰罗姆·鲍威尔的讲话，以了解未来加息的迹象。中国央行面临两难选择，是保护银行利润还是房地产？日经亚洲，中国的央行中国人民银行 PBOC 令市场感到意外，将5年期贷款基准利率 LPR 保持在 4.2% 不变，而只将1年期利率下调10个基点至 3.45%。保持5年期利率的决定被视为是为了保护商业银行的净利差 NIM， 并确保金融系统保持健康。然而，这一举措预计不会使消费者或房地产开发商受益，因为房贷还款不会减少，新贷款也没有太大的激励。俄罗斯和中国在金砖国家峰会上寻求进一步推动政治议程。法国国际广播电台，来自金砖国家经济集团的领导人，包括巴西、俄罗斯、印度、中国和南非，将在约翰内斯堡举行为期3天的会议。中国国家主席习近平的出席凸显了中国在过去10年对该集团的投资。由于国际刑事法院对俄罗斯总统弗拉基米尔·普京在乌克兰战争中的逮捕令，普京将通过视频连线出席。预计此次峰会将呼吁全球南方国家加强合作，反映出对西方主导全球机构的不满。峰会还将讨论金砖国家未来可能扩大成员国的问题，一些非洲国家已表示有兴趣加入。
Today we're discussing the Confucius Institute's, that is the CCP presence on American university campuses. This is part of a phenomenon called Chinese transnational repression. It's happening on US soil. It's affecting American students, especially those who are Chinese American or who are Chinese exchange students, or those who are interested in and focused on Chinese politics in some way on American campuses. So we have with us two experts who have written reports on this and studied it in depth. We have Ian Oxnevad, who is a senior fellow in foreign affairs and security studies at the National Association of Scholars. And we also have Cynthia Sun, who is a researcher and co-author of a report for Falun Gong on this issue. So welcome. I'm very happy we have your expertise in trying to really get a grasp on this problem of CCP, that's Chinese Communist Party infiltration of American campuses, college campuses. It's been a persistent problem. We've been hearing about it in the news for several years, but it continues. And those of us who have been in colleges or have students, have family members who are students, we've been hearing about some of these problems as well firsthand. So Ian, I'd like to start with you. You have overseen a number of reports on this topic and over 5 years or so. Can you tell us what some of the parameters are? What does this look like? What is the problem? What are Confucius Institutes? Are they still around? There's a lot of confusion about whether this problem has been solved or not. They seem to be not as prevalent as before. Tell us about this.
So the problem that we're really talking about here is CCP influence on campuses. And the motivation for that is multiple. Part of it is soft power projection, or the shaping of perceptions about China, specifically the CCP. Part of it is also access to American universities more broadly for fundamental research purposes, because that has an impact on China's ability to obtain dual-use technologies. Those are technologies that have uses in military or commercial purposes. And then you also have a sort of an elite capture issue with this, in the sense that you are looking at shaping the views of future policymakers and key individuals in America in the future by shaping the views of students today. So Confucius Institutes were just kind of one phase of this. And for those who don't know, Confucius Institutes were basically were, because there are multiple countries, there's a few left in the US, not many, but these are Chinese language centers that are underwritten by the Chinese government. The teachers that are in these universities, in these programs, they're chosen by the government, and it's run by Chinese government bureaucracies in Beijing. Since there's been a massive pushback on Confucius Institutes, both Confucius Institutes have basically shut down. Oftentimes they're being rebranded as different programs in a non-sort of systematic way. It is systematic on the Chinese side, but they don't have that label anymore. And in terms of the bureaucracies involved, China was cognizant enough of the blowback that Confucius Institutes were receiving to change the name of the bureaucracies that manage this. So now there's several that actually do this. But they're problematic for a number of reasons. They erode intellectual freedom. Oftentimes there's money involved that American campuses receive from China in order to host these institutes, and the contracts involved are very opaque. There's entanglement issues, and they, in the sense that these Confucius Institutes and their replacements, in some cases, have allowed China to monitor dissidents abroad and continue sort of soft power initiatives. So those are some of the main.
Can I interrupt at this point and ask you, what are those contracts? Are they with the government of China, or some branch of the Chinese government, or the universities?
Oftentimes it was, and I can think of a few key examples with this. So basically what would happen is the Hanban, which has been renamed since then, since the pushback has occurred, these universities at the US side would receive funding and materials and teachers from the Hanban, which is basically the Chinese government. They would partner with Chinese universities as well. And this is another aspect of this, that it's not just direct. Well, it is direct, but it's not as necessarily clear cut as a direct bureaucracy interfacing with an American campus. It's also Chinese universities that are basically extensions of the Chinese government, because there's no private Chinese institutions involved we're talking about here.
And the contracts, are they transparent? Do we know does the universities post them on the web, or how do we?
No. So oftentimes the contracts only came to light after they had been signed, often to the chagrin of multiple actors on campus, whether you're talking about the student body, professors, trustees. Many times these were sort of done almost in secret between administrators and China.
And you talk about pushback. What do you mean? Who gave the pushback? Was it the universities and college administration, or what happened there?
Not really the administrators. The pushback came from sort of popular sentiment, professors, the student body in many cases, from across the political spectrum in the US. You also had pushback from policymakers as the threat of China has sort of grown in sort of popular consciousness, particularly since COVID. But over the past few years, that's steadily grown to the point that the brand of Confucius Institutes became toxic. So now what's happening, unfortunately, is that bilateral ties between Chinese universities and American universities are forming in different fields that are more specifically scientific oriented and other programs of that nature. Not really Confucius Institutes, because Confucius Institutes themselves really are not the problem. They're just one manifestation of it.
Yeah, well, they were considered by the Chinese government, I think, as an important tool for their propaganda effort. High-level cultural official in China actually was quoted saying that a number of years ago in the Chinese government press. So, I mean, they saw it as an important tool, and I guess they've been replaced by other means. And the CCP presence is certainly still on campuses, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And what's happening is that many schools in the US are forming bilateral ties with Chinese universities that have military ties to the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army in China. And oftentimes these, coincidentally, are American universities that have some sort of defense-related program or department involved. And I can think of a few key examples of that, but that's what's happening now.
So they're specializing, is what you're saying. Is that correct? That there's not just a blanket surveillance of Chinese exchange students, for example. They're specializing in trying to be strategic about which areas of the university they can penetrate.
Yeah, and that's what's happening. So, for example, we had one case that actually came to us. A number of people reached out mentioning Alfred University, which recently shut down its Confucius Institute. It had received a multi-million-dollar contract from the US government to help perfect hypersonic missile technology. And some of the same individuals involved in the engineering ceramics program at Alfred University were also tied to the Confucius Institute. So that was one example. Another thing that we're seeing as well, that we're also currently working on exploring further, is National Centers of Academic Excellence, which seems really innocuous. But these are US campuses that receive DoD or NSA funding, or government funding rather, to basically expand their cybersecurity programs. And oftentimes there seems to be a correlation between the schools that receive this funding and ties to China. And we're seeing that also as well.
Cynthia, I'm going to turn to you. You've also done a report on campuses and the CCP influence on those campuses. Can you tell us your key findings about that, and how you have done this report for Falun Gong Spiritual Group? Can you tell us how that relates to Falun Gong?
Sure. In tandem with what Ian was saying, actually, we saw a lot of physical and digital surveillance by Chinese proxies. So just to set the scene, nationwide, there are at least 45 universities and colleges with students or faculty who practice Falun Gong on campus. So on these college campuses, usually they will establish Falun Gong clubs to host events like petition signing, film screenings, art exhibitions, to try to raise awareness about the persecution that's been going on for over 24 years now. And in spite of the effort that they're trying to do, the grassroots campaign on advocacy, raising awareness about human rights, there's a lot of reprisals that they face and a lot of consequences that they're unfortunately faced with because they're hosting these events and they're participating in activities in America. So just to give you the scope, the pool of students and faculty include both Chinese and non-Chinese adherents. And from the Chinese adherents, some are second-generation American citizens who have family, elderly relatives back in China. And then there's also Chinese international students who have to go back to China after their studies. And so in this pool of people, there's actually 20% of our survey respondents in our report said they felt uncomfortable self-identifying as a Falun Gong practitioner because of the reprisals that they faced and because of all of the fear they have from the indoctrination, all the propaganda surrounding, their practice.
Yeah, in 1999, I just want to tell our listeners, the president of China at the time, Jiang Zemin, vowed to eradicate, to eliminate Falun Gong from China. And he set up an infrastructure called 610 within the bureaucracies of state and the party to carry this out. And so there have been mass arrests in labor camps, detentions, indefinite detentions without any due process, as well as trials and sentencing and other forms of really harsh punishment for practicing Falun Gong back in China. So what they're concerned about is that the practice continues here, and they use the leverage, from what you're saying, do I understand this right? They're
Yes.
using the leverage back in China with people with family members who are themselves students here on exchange and going back to China, that they fear imprisonment or detention or worse.
Yes, and also their family members. So one quote that I have from the survey that I wanted to bring up is a Chinese international student from California said, quote, family members in China were called regarding my whereabouts, my phone number, where I was studying or working. And along those lines, several other students reported feeling watched and their families were harassed due to their activities in the United States. So these are family members that are Falun Gong practitioners and also aren't Falun Gong practitioners, have nothing to do with the faith at all, except that they're family members. And so they're using that as blackmail to threaten and intimidate these students to try to get them to stop holding these activities, holding these events, and exposing the CCP's crimes.
So they want to silence any type of criticism and suppress the profile. They want to suppress the mere presence of Falun Gong as well. And that is probably, in addition, accompanies what Ian was describing of wanting to learn technology and academic learning about cyber information and so forth on our campuses, spying on the campuses for gathering intellectual property and certain skill sets and levels of learning.
Yeah, for sure. And like Ian was also saying earlier, it's a control of what the party wants people to believe, what the party wants people to say and
controlling
think.
The narrative,
exactly,
the ideological narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so through controlling activities of Falun Gong practitioners, Hong Kong activists, and like other ethnic minorities in China, it's possible for them to also like bring that here, bring the surveillance, the slander, the censorship to the United States of America. Actually, when you were saying earlier about controlling the narrative, there's actually a poignant example of this. I have a friend at the University of Pennsylvania, and she was a graduate student during COVID. And she hosted a virtual screening with on Confucius Institutes with some people that you may be familiar with, and you as well, Ian. Rochelle Peterson, with my friend Rory O'Connor, who's a part of the Athenae Institute. And after the event ended, it's a virtual event, it's a film screening about Confucius Institutes at the University of Pennsylvania, over 79 students and alumni associated with CSSA, the Chinese Student Scholar Association, sent complaints to administration, to the Graduate Student Council. They posted hateful comments on all of the Facebook posts promoting the event. And they made such a ruckus that administration actually hosted 2 roundtables, did not invite
the graduate student who's a Falun Gong practitioner, who this was targeting. And they gave a platform for the CSSA members to present why Falun Gong is a cult to administration and to student council.
That's just really outrageous.
And it was, yeah.
Tell us more about CSSA. What is it? What are they supposed to be doing on campus? How prevalent are they? Are they the descendant now, the next generation of the Confucius Institutes? It sounds like it.
CSSAs have been around for over 20 years, I believe. They're
Chinese
Student and Scholars Association. And they're essentially an organization, or supposedly a student organization for Chinese international students to come and celebrate their heritage, celebrate their common interests. And it's actually a proxy of the Chinese state. And a New York student actually said, quote, "The association, CSSA, at our university was very much in the pocket of the Chinese government." And we've seen this with a lot of CSSAs. They're funded by their local Chinese consulate or the nearest one, and they receive direction also from the Chinese consulate. There was a student in Chicago a few years back who was part of the CSSA because he was also a Chinese international student, but he also happens to practice Falun Gong. And his friend was actually the president of CSSA at the time. And that president received direction from the Chicago consulate to remove the graduate student who practiced Falun Gong off the roster. So he was kicked out of the organization purely based on his faith. And
at the direction of the
Chinese consulate. And you know, the president couldn't do anything about it because he was forced to on that basis. And so I think that just speaks to how much they really are a proxy, and they carry forth this message of continued self-censorship, of continued surveillance, of different incidents where, you know, it's really hard to fathom how this could be happening in American universities. But through CSSAs and through the presence of Confucius Institutes, I think it's very much alive, this, you know, this continued party thought and party culture.
Yeah, I have a young friend who graduated recently from a year ago from a Ivy League university. And he said that during COVID lockdown here, the students were back on campus, but they were having webinars to fill in some of the time when the wave of the disease would come through. And they were talking about, in one of the webinars, someone on the group in the class brought up the zero COVID policy in China and was complaining about, or pointing out how harsh it was. And there was a group of students, Chinese students, on the call who shut this down and said it was hate speech. And there are other examples. GW University here in Washington, George Washington University, had an exhibit of Chinese political protest posters by an artist, a well-known artist, and that was some Chinese students and their friends, their allies on campus, demanded that they be pulled down, and the president complied. And then he heard the other side. He heard the pushback that this is actually legitimate political speech. And the president, to his credit, reconsidered at George Washington and allowed the posters to be put back. But I wonder if this is all sort of the undercurrent that's going on that is invisible to us on the outside from these student associations. Ian, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and this is kind of a broader thing that I don't think anyone in the West really fathoms to a mass degree with regards to the CCP. In a totalitarian country, whether it's, you know, communist or not, a different ideology, there's no real separation between civil society and the state, at least in the way that totalitarian state perceives it. So here, you know, you have universities who may see themselves as partnering with benign, independent Chinese universities, or, you know, student groups that in the mind of the universities, these are civil society. They're not tied to the Chinese state. But that's not the case on the Chinese side. These are extensions and proxies of the Chinese state. And if they're not directly fully controlled by the Chinese state, they're certainly influenced by it. So there's no real distinction between private and political life in that sense. And that's something that a lot of universities and the West more broadly doesn't really understand when it's addressing China.
Yeah, that isn't well understood. And, one thing that you've also said, Ian, was that you said to me that the there's certain glamour or prestige with having exchanges with Chinese universities. And I have seen that in my own research on forced organ harvesting, of all things, that the medical schools and medical schools here and hospitals have given a lot to the Chinese transplant center, including trained up about 344 transplant surgeons from China. And why did they do it? Why did they share the skills and the knowledge and funding in some cases? Well, a lot of it was, to say that their universities were part of this global expanse of enlightenment or, technology. And it's very, very naive because these are dual use. And you pointed this out in the Alfred University case, that they are really looking for specific advancements to advance the Chinese Communist Party regime in military and science.
Yeah, we're seeing that institutional overlap. Now, to be fair, we didn't find any smoking guns with Alfred other than a massive close proximity between the Confucius Institute and the ceramics program that was funded by the DoD that was working on hypersonic missile technology. But to your point, the prestige is there, and that's the main incentive for a lot of these universities to develop these programs in the first place, these partnerships. And I've seen universities that have whole pages on their websites devoted to international programs, and you think international programs, and then it has the universities listed, and they all happen to be in communist China. And you see that quite a bit, and partly because other countries are not putting the efforts in to build these bilateral programs to the same degree that China is. You would expect to see other countries present in a lot of these programs, but they're simply not there.
I think your study said, though, that DoD, the Defense Department, leaned on Alfred and said that they would not continue funding their program if they didn't divorce themselves from this program with China.
Yes, absolutely.
I wanted to make a point about that. I feel like in terms of the forced organ harvesting, in terms of Confucius Institutes, and in terms of how universities have displayed their, unpreparedness in reacting to all the Falun Gong transnational repression incidents, it seems like, in general, universities are unprepared to deal with Chinese proxies, and that should be changed.
China government proxies.
China government shock. Yeah.
It's almost a willful blindness. I mean, because there is a lot of information. Both of your associations have been publishing a lot of information. We have as well at Hudson Institute. And so there's no dearth of information, but there was a skepticism before COVID. Actually, I think it was when Secretary Pompeo designated the Uyghurs as victims of CCP genocide. And this was in early 2021. The COVID was, we were told it didn't emanate from a lab. It was just an accident, and who knows who did it. And we still don't know the answers to that. But there was a willingness to believe China on these things and to say this is just Trumpian politics or right-wing politics. And I think that has changed. I mean, the Biden administration came in also in early 2021 and said that there's a real problem here with the Uyghurs. This is genocide as well. They validated that finding. And I think there was a greater skepticism then. And around the same time, Xi Jinping, the president of China, was announcing to the world at the Communist Congress that he was going to replace the international world order, the world order that has existed since World War II, led by the United States and built on principles of sovereignty and non-aggression and freedom. So what does that new world order look like? Part of it is, we're seeing it, I think, in this transnational repression on campuses. I wonder what more we can be doing. You know, Ian, you've mentioned a few things. Is there something that you'd like to add to that about what the United States, will the campuses, will the university administrations ever act, or is this going to require some legislation, do you think?
It's going to require legislation, both at the federal and the state level, to be quite frank, because the universities either don't understand it or they simply don't care. Oftentimes, administrators at universities, they may have no background in geopolitical or international, business affairs or anything like that to fully grasp this. And sometimes they simply turn a blind eye to it because there's sort of this sense of almost autonomy in many universities, where they almost envision themselves as a jurisdiction in and of themselves. And so it is going to have to come from the outside. But one thing that has to change, and change very quickly, not just with China, but also with foreign influence on universities more broadly, because we found Russian money present in sensitive areas. We've found Saudi and Iranian influence on other things that we're working on. So this is not just a Chinese specific issue.
One thing that is specific, though, if I could interrupt, is the number of Chinese students in the United States in these colleges. And I think college administrations fear that if they forbid something or kick out a Chinese government-controlled entity or suppress it, that they will be the loser, that the campus will be the loser, that the students will go elsewhere. They'll go to the next state university or the next in the next country.
Sure, and this is a question of educational sovereignty, and this is a political question, valid political question in the U.S. Is why are we educating foreign elites in hostile countries? Why are we educating the middle class for foreign countries that are hostile to the U.S.? That's a bigger question.
Well, I think that question is going to be really hard to solve, but I think that it may be more effective to have legislation or a government order, executive order, stopping these institutes and their proxies and the CCP proxies on campuses, and tying it to finances of the universities.
Yeah, one thing that we have focused on since our second report that came out last year is this idea of ratio funding, which basically mandates that for every foreign dollar of any source from a foreign entity, universities that obtain that funding are then eligible, or ineligible rather, for an exact same amount from taxpayer sources. And that would change the incentives for universities to enter into agreements.
That's a great idea.
China.
Cynthia, you had work on textbooks as well. Can you describe that? Yeah, can you tell us about the problem and what it is?
Yeah, so that's actually, also a solution, also a recommendation. So the Falun Dafa Information Center, our new report actually has a recommendation within the university to vet material that's taught like in curriculum for Chinese language classes. And this is really important because last semester, there was a student in Amherst who was taking an intermediate Chinese class, and she found out that her textbook and her homework was basically full of anti-Falun Gong propaganda. It said that Falun Gong will drive you to madness, that it was completely superstitious, that there was just a lot of really bad, like I don't even want to repeat it.
This was in the language,
Amherst, yes.
Amherst language textbook.
And you know what? After she dug into that book, it's actually sold on Amazon. I have a copy of it at home just for research purposes. It's taught in at least 12 other schools, including Yale University, including Southern California, including other universities like across the nation, and it's seen as a reputable textbook. But it also has anti-American sentiment. It also has completely like misconceptions about AIDS, about different campaigns that the CCP is really focused on, you know, controlling the narrative around. And it's just outrageous that that curriculum wasn't vetted, that it wasn't, you know, given a check by someone.
Is that still being used? It's still sold on Amazon, right?
Yes, it's still sold on Amazon. And as of last semester, end of 2022, it was still being used at Amherst University.
We'll have to look into that.
Yes. And
As
so
a Smith
that was,
College grad, I know Amherst very well, and I'm stunned. It's
yeah, and this is only the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion, because we don't know what's being taught at other language classes around, like all around the United States, right? This is only like one that we found.
you sampled.
That we sampled, and so that's one of our main recommendations would be to have someone to vet the curriculum. You could even contact us and we'll go through it for you. But just the fact that this is being taught to American students who are interested, genuinely interested in Chinese culture and learning the language, and then this is what's being indoctrinated and what's going in, because you have to translate that, you have to review it, you have to take a test on it. So it's like, it's really getting in deep.
You know, one of the directors of our Hudson Institute is Mitch Daniels, and he was the president of Purdue University for a while. And in December 2021, he wrote a letter that I like to quote. He says, "Dear Purdue students, staff, and faculty, Purdue learned from a national news account last week that one of our students, after speaking out on behalf of freedom and others martyred for advocating it," that was about Tiananmen, was Tiananmen massacre, was harassed and threatened by other students from his own home country. Worse still, his family back home, in this case China, was visited and threatened by agents of that nation's secret police. And he goes on to say that we're not going to accept this type of intimidation. So I think that there is hope for some universities, and they've been very courageous. Ian, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, so I think one of the key takeaways to look at this is, you know, universities, there's a desire for openness that is in direct tension with the risks that that openness poses in terms of allowing influence from totalitarian countries to be present on campus. And that can take the guise of multiple programs, whether it be student organizations or partnerships with key universities abroad. And that's something that has to change in terms of how our university system is managed and regulated.